Fall asleep to I am paid in full. 3 hours of overnight wealth affirmations. Florence Scovel Shinn. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the words you allow yourself to fall asleep repeating are the very words that quietly rearrange your accounts while you are far too at rest to argue with them or block them. There is an old promise tucked into the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 24, and it reads, "When thou liest down, thou shalt not be afraid. Yea, thou shalt lie down, and thy sleep shall be sweet." And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The sweetness of your sleep was never about how tired your body was. It was a promise about the state of your consciousness at the exact threshold of rest." Most of us cross that threshold still counting what we owe, still rehearsing the unpaid bill, the overdue notice, the tight month. We drift off inside the very story we are trying to escape, and then we wonder, quietly, why the account looks the same in the morning. You are not the only one who has done this. Almost everyone has fallen asleep, worrying, at least once believing that worry was simply what a responsible person does. But worry is a prayer said backward, and tonight we are going to say it forward instead. Before we go further, let us plant a true word in your mouth right now, something simple you can carry into your evening and into your sleep. Say it with me. Every debt dissolves in the presence of divine substance. I am paid in full while I rest. My word is my wand. And again, every debt dissolves in the presence of divine substance. I am paid in full while I rest. My word is my wand. If something in you just went quiet when you spoke those words, that quiet is worth honoring. Type the 2 words, God supplies, into the comments below. Let it be your seal on what you have just claimed. Not a comment for the algorithm, but a small altar you built in public, a place where you said out loud, in front of witnesses, that you believe supply already knows your name. The first key is, notice the small, careless words you speak about money without even hearing yourself say them. A man stands in a checkout line and murmurs, "I cannot afford this." Before he has even glanced at the price, a woman signs a lease and sighs, "I will be broke after this." Before the ink is even dry, these are not observations, Florence Scovel Shinn taught. They are declarations. The subconscious mind does not check your bank balance before it obeys you. It simply takes the sentence you handed it and gets to work building a world that matches it. Picture an ordinary Tuesday. A man named nobody in particular pours his coffee and says to the empty kitchen, "Money just slips through my fingers." He does not mean anything by it. It feels like small talk with himself, but his own ears are listening, and his own subconscious is taking notes. By lunchtime, a co-worker mentions a bonus, and before he can stop himself, he says, "Must be nice. Must be nice" is not a compliment. It is a vote cast against his own supply. By evening, his card is declined for a small purchase, and he mutters, "Of course. Typical." And there it is again. A life quietly narrated into being one throwaway sentence at a time. None of these moments felt important while they were happening. That is exactly why they were so powerful. We guard our big prayers carefully, but we leave the back door of our mouths wide open all day long, and supply, or the lack of it, walks in through that unguarded door. Consider, too, a mother standing at a school supply table, counting out coins for her daughter, and saying, gently but firmly, "We simply cannot afford the extra notebook." The daughter does not remember the notebook a week later, but she remembers the sentence, tucked away quietly, learning early what the family believes about supply, without a single harsh word ever being spoken. A whole inheritance can be passed down this way, not in a will, but in a habit of speech repeated at kitchen tables and checkout lines. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn urged such careful listening to your own voice. Because you are not only speaking to yourself, you are speaking a legacy into the ears of everyone near enough to absorb it. So this week, catch yourself. Just once a day is enough to begin. Catch the moment you say, I cannot afford it, or money is tight, or I am always broke, and in that same breath, replace it. Say instead, I am paid in full. Supply meets me here. It will feel strange at first. Like wearing a coat that does not yet fit. Wear it anyway, because it is not a small habit you are correcting, it is a whole future you are quietly rewriting one sentence at a time. The old sentence built the old life, brick by careless brick, and the new sentence, spoken with the same casual authority, will build the new one just as surely. It is not what is in your wallet that decides what comes next. It is what is on your tongue. Try this even in the smallest exchanges. When a friend jokes about being poor this month, you do not have to join the chorus. You can simply say, for me, supply is steady, and let that be enough. When you catch yourself reaching for, must be nice, replace it with how wonderful, and mean it, because what you bless with your words, you invite toward your own door. Notice also how differently a room feels when someone speaks of money with ease rather than dread. The shoulders loosen, the breath deepens. Even strangers relax slightly in the presence of a person who has stopped narrating lack out loud. And once you begin listening to your own voice differently, you begin to notice how many people around you are building their poverty with their mouths. Gently, without judgment, because you were doing it too, and now you are simply doing something else. Catch the sentence, change the sentence, and let the coins that fall from your mouth turn into light instead of chains. I no longer speak lack into being. I speak paid in full. The second key is, understand that paid in full is a state of consciousness you step into, not a sum that arrives and then convinces you afterward. Florence Scovel Shinn taught this again and again in different language, that the outer condition is only ever a photograph of the inner state. It develops on its own schedule, but it is always developing from the same negative. Think of it the way you might think of a thermostat rather than a thermometer. A thermometer simply reports the temperature of the room as it already is, but a thermostat sets the temperature the room is about to become. Most people live like thermometers where money is concerned, reading their anxiety off the current balance and reporting it back to themselves all day long. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught you to live like a thermostat instead, setting the inner climate first and letting the room slowly rise to meet it. A woman she once wrote about needed money urgently, and rather than pacing and calculating and refreshing her accounts 40 times a day, she simply began to feel, quietly and privately, as though the matter were already settled. She moved through her day the way a person moves who has already been paid, unhurried, ungrasping, almost amused at her own former anxiety, and within a short while, the outer facts rearranged themselves to agree with the inner claim. Consider a very ordinary man, a shopkeeper named Walter, who spent every Tuesday morning dreading a supplier's invoice, sitting unopened on his desk. He would arrive early just to stare at it, feel his stomach tighten, rehearse excuses in his mind before anyone had even asked him for anything. One Tuesday, tired of his own dread, he decided to try something different. Before he even opened the shop, he sat in his car for 5 quiet minutes and simply let himself feel, on purpose, the way a man feels who owes nothing to anyone, shoulders loose, breath slow, no argument running in his chest. He did not know how the invoice would be handled. He only knew he was tired of handing his mornings over to fear, before fear had even proven anything. He walked in that day lighter, and strangely, calmer with his customers, warmer even, and by the end of the week a client he had almost forgotten about settled an old order in full, covering the very invoice that had haunted his Tuesdays for months. This is the part people resist, because it feels backward. We have been trained to believe that feeling comes after the check clears. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught the opposite order entirely. The feeling is the check clearing on the inner plane first. It is not the evidence that produces the peace. It is the peace that produces the evidence. Think of the state as a seed and the circumstance as the fruit. No one stands over a seed demanding to see the fruit before they are willing to plant it. And yet with money we do this constantly. We say, "Show me the harvest first, and then I will believe in the planting." But a seed does not work backward, and neither does consciousness. So tonight, before you sleep, do not wait for proof to feel paid in full. Borrow the feeling now. The way you might borrow a coat that belongs to the person you are becoming. Wear the calm of someone with nothing left to worry about, even for 5 minutes, even while the bill is still technically unpaid on paper, because paper is slow, and consciousness is not. Paper simply obeys eventually, once the state has been established, long enough that it can no longer be denied. Notice too how this state, once claimed, changes the small things around it without effort. The tone of your voice on a phone call, the patience you offer a cashier, the way you walk into a room without bracing. These are not decorations, they are the visible edges of an inner decision already made. This is why so many people work themselves to exhaustion chasing supply and never quite catch it. They are chasing the photograph instead of adjusting the negative, straining at the fruit while refusing to touch the seed. And the moment you understand this, you stop chasing altogether, and you start, instead, becoming, quietly, without announcement, the very state you once thought you had to wait for circumstances to hand you. I am the state I choose to feel, not the balance I fear. The third key is, know that your subconscious mind does not argue with you once you are asleep. During the day, the moment you speak a truth, like "I am paid in full," some part of you glances at the mail pile and quietly objects. Some part of you remembers the exact number sitting in the account and folds its arms, and refuses to be moved by a single sentence. This is simply the nature of the waking mind. It was trained for years to demand proof before it will believe anything. But the moment sleep begins to take you, that objecting voice grows tired and steps aside the way a tired guard finally sits down at the end of a long shift. And whatever sentence you were holding in that last conscious moment sinks in the way a stone sinks into still water. Undisturbed, unquestioned, left to settle at the bottom and become part of the ground itself. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the subconscious is a faithful servant, but it is not a discerning one. It does not decide whether the sentence you hand it is true. It only decides how thoroughly to build around it. Hand it fear, and it will build a fortress of fear. Hand it paid in full, and it will build a house of paid in full, with the very same tireless devotion. It does not choose sides. It only obeys the last clear instruction it was given. This is why the words you repeat right before sleep carry a weight that words spoken at noon simply do not carry. At noon, you are negotiating with your own doubt. Doubt is standing right there in the room with you, arms crossed, keeping receipts. But at midnight, on the edge of rest, there is no negotiation left, only reception. The door is open and unattended, and whoever arrives last is the one who gets to move in. Think of it almost like a lock that only accepts the final key pressed into it before it clicks shut for the night. It does not remember every key that was tried earlier in the day. It only remembers the one still turning as the door closes. So if the last key you turned was worry, worry is what gets sealed in until morning. And if the last key you turned was paid in full, that is what gets sealed in instead. The lock itself has no opinion. It simply holds whatever was still in it at the moment of closing. Think of two neighbors living on the very same street, facing, that particular month, the very same tight finances, the same stretch between paychecks. The first neighbor spends her evening at the kitchen table, with the bills spread out under the lamp, running the numbers again and again, long after the numbers have already told her everything they are going to tell her. She rehearses the shortfall in her mind, turns it over, argues with it, tries to solve by sheer repetition what repetition was never going to solve, and she carries that exact tension, unfinished and raw, straight into her pillow, still subtracting in her sleep. Her final waking thought is a question mark, and a question mark is exactly what gets planted. The second neighbor pays what she can, sets the rest aside for tomorrow's clearer mind. And before she closes her eyes, she says, quietly, only to herself, I am paid in full, not because the bills have vanished, they have not, but because she has decided which sentence gets to cross the threshold with her. She does not argue herself into believing it, she simply repeats it plainly, the way you might repeat an address to someone dropping you home, calmly, without drama, because it does not need convincing, it only needs stating. In the morning, the actual numbers in each of their accounts are still identical. Nothing outside either woman has changed overnight, and yet one of them wakes already braced for another hard day, and the other wakes strangely light, almost rested in a way sleep alone cannot explain. That lightness is not luck. It is simply the residue of what was allowed to sink in undisturbed while she slept. This is not magic in the way people mean when they say the word carelessly, hoping for something for nothing. It is simply the honest mechanics of a mind that always builds toward whatever it was last shown, and was never told to stop building just because the sun went down. Pause for a moment right now, and think back over your own recent nights. Notice, honestly and without judging yourself for it, what sentence usually gets to speak last. Is it the bill? Is it the comparison? Is it the tired arithmetic of a hard day? Or is it something you chose on purpose? Most people have never once asked themselves this question. They assume whatever crosses their mind last is simply chance. A stray thought among many, but nothing that closes a day is truly stray. It is the seed selected, whether knowingly or not. So tonight, take this seriously as a practice, and not merely a pleasant idea. In the last minute before your eyes close, do not let the day's leftover arithmetic be the final word. Do not let the unopened bill be the last visitor let in. Choose, deliberately, on purpose, the one sentence you most want, multiplied by the night. Let it be simple enough to repeat without straining, quiet enough to carry you gently rather than jolt you awake again. I am paid in full, said the way you might say it to someone who already believes you completely. And let that be the stone that sinks tonight, settling quietly at the bottom while you rest. Becoming, brick by unseen brick, the very ground you will stand on tomorrow. I plant paid in full in sleep, and reap it awake. The fourth key is, let the old debtor self dissolve, so the paid in full self can finally rise. And I want to be very careful and very clear with you here, because this teaching is often misunderstood. When we speak of a self dying, we do not mean any harm to you, we do not mean your body, we do not mean the people around you. We mean only this, that the false identity you have been wearing, the one who is always behind, always apologizing for money, always bracing for the next shortfall, that identity was never the truth of you. It was only a costume you picked up somewhere along the way and forgot to take off. And it can be laid down now, gently, the way you lay down a heavy coat at the end of a long journey. First, consider how this false self was built in the first place. Nobody is born believing they are behind on life. A child does not enter the world already apologizing for existing. This identity was assembled slowly, out of moments, a worried conversation overheard at a kitchen table, a bounced check that became a family story told at every gathering, a comparison made at school between what you had and what someone else had. Each of these moments left behind a small brick, and over years those bricks became a wall, and eventually you stopped seeing the wall as something built and started seeing it as something true. You began introducing yourself with it. I have always struggled with money. I am just not good with finances. These are not facts, Florence Scovel Shinn taught. They are old bricks, dressed up as identity. And here is something worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Most people never chose their debtor self at all. It was handed to them the way a name is handed to a newborn, without consultation, A woman named Ruth grew up in a house where her grandmother spoke of the Great Depression as though it had happened last week, where every meal carried a faint undertone of scarcity, even when the table was full. Ruth absorbed this not as a story about her grandmother's life, but as a fact about her own. By the time she was grown, she had never once questioned the sentence, "We do not have enough." It simply felt like breathing. It felt like her own voice. When she finally sat down one evening, tired in a way sleep could not fix, and asked herself honestly, "Whose voice is this really?" she realized with a kind of quiet shock that she had been living out someone else's fear for 30 years, without ever once checking whether it belonged to her at all. And Ruth is not alone in this. Consider also a man named Arthur, who ran a small hardware store his father had left him. His father had lost the store once, years before Arthur was even born, and rebuilt it slowly, bitterly. And Arthur grew up hearing the phrase, "We almost lost everything," spoken so often it became furniture in the house. Something you simply stepped around. Arthur inherited the store. But he also inherited the bracing. He kept 2 months of extra inventory he never needed, just in case. He underpaid himself for years, just in case. He flinched every time a customer asked for credit, not because the store could not afford it, but because some old ghost in him still expected the collapse his father had once survived. One afternoon, an old employee asked him plainly, "Arthur, the books are healthy. Why do you still run this place like it is burning down?" And Arthur had no honest answer, except that fear had been left to him the way the building itself had been left to him, unasked for, and quietly assumed to be permanent. Second, consider what it actually means to let this self die. It does not mean pretending the bricks were never there. It does not mean denying that bills exist or that seasons have been hard. It means you stop feeding that old identity your attention. The way you might stop watering a plant you no longer want growing in your garden. You do not have to uproot it violently. You simply stop giving it water. Stop giving it the daily nourishment of your speech, your worry, your rehearsed complaints, and starved of that attention. It withers on its own. This is the death Florence Scovel Shinn pointed toward. Not a death of you, but a death of the false report about you, and in its place, the real self rises, the self that was always whole, always provided for, always, in truth, paid in full, underneath all that borrowed worry. It can help here to notice that you have already done this kind of dying before. Without ever calling it that, think of a version of yourself from years ago, someone who once believed something about themselves that now seems almost foreign. A person who was terrified of a phone call they now make without a second thought. A person who once believed they were simply not the type to speak up, and now speaks up without even remembering the old fear. That old self did not have to be dragged out kicking and fighting. It simply stopped being fed, and one day you looked back and realized it was gone. The debtor self can leave exactly the same quiet way, and Arthur, in time, did something small that mattered more than he expected. He stopped repeating, "We almost lost everything," to his own staff, as a kind of cautionary joke. He simply let the sentence go unused, unrepeated, and within a season he noticed the store itself felt different to walk into, lighter somehow, though nothing on the shelves had changed. Third, consider how to actually do this in an ordinary week, because teaching without practice is only a nice idea. So let us walk through a single day together, honestly, the way it might actually go. You wake at 7, and before your feet even touch the floor, the old self tries to speak first. It whispers something about the payment due on the 15th. This is the moment, right here, half awake, where the choice is made. You can let that voice narrate your morning, or you can meet it gently and say, "That is not who I am anymore. I am paid in full." By 9, you are at your desk, and a coworker mentions a raise they received, and the old self flinches, comparing, calculating what you lack against what they gained. And again, the choice. You can let the flinch run the rest of your hour, or you can bless their increase and quietly claim your own. By noon, a bill notification appears on your phone, and your stomach tightens the way it always has. This is the old self's favorite hour. It has been trained on this exact feeling for years. But you pause, you breathe, and you say inwardly, "This bill is not my identity. It is only a piece of paper passing through a life that is already provided for." By 2 in the afternoon, a small unexpected expense comes up, a flat tire, a forgotten fee, exactly the kind of thing that used to send the old self spiraling for the rest of the day. Rehearsing disaster, and you notice yourself almost laugh, quietly, at how automatically the old script tried to load itself, and you simply set it down instead. By 3 in the afternoon you catch yourself, almost automatically, saying to a friend, "Oh, I could never afford that." And you stop mid-sentence, and you feel something almost like humor at how quickly the old script tried to run itself again. And you simply do not finish the sentence the old way. By 5, driving home, a billboard for a vacation you cannot presently imagine taking flashes past you, and the old self reaches for its familiar ache. That quiet must be nice, and you catch it in the air before it lands, and you say instead, "How wonderful, that is on its way to me too." By evening, you sit down to whatever the day has actually handed you, and instead of tallying what went wrong, you notice, quite plainly, that you made it through an entire day without a single actual catastrophe. The fear was louder than the facts. It almost always is. And by the time you lie down to sleep, you have, without a dramatic ceremony, without lightning or thunder, simply lived one more day as someone slightly less loyal to the old debtor identity. That is what this death actually looks like. It is not an event. It is 1,000 small refusals stacked gently on top of each other until the old self simply has nowhere left to stand. Fourth, consider why so many people resist this dying, even when the old identity clearly brings them pain. And be gentle with yourself here, if you recognize it. The old debtor self, worn long enough, becomes strangely familiar, even comfortable in its own bitter way. It asks nothing new of you. It requires no risk. If you have always struggled with money, then no one is disappointed when you continue to struggle. There is a hidden safety in the old costume, and letting it go can feel, for a moment, like stepping out into open air without a coat. This is normal. This is not failure. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the old self will often make its loudest case for staying right at the very moment it is closest to leaving. It is not a sign you have done something wrong. It is simply the last argument of a tenant who knows the lease is ending. And Arthur felt exactly this the week before he finally cleared out that unneeded extra inventory. A sudden, sharp urge to order, even more than usual, just in case, as if the old fear knew its time in the store was ending and wanted one last purchase order in its name. Fifth, consider that this dissolving is rarely finished in a single sitting. It is closer to tending a garden than to demolishing a building. Some mornings the old growth pushes back up through soil you thought was cleared. A familiar tightness in the chest at the sight of an envelope, a familiar apology rising in your throat before a purchase. This does not mean the death did not take. It simply means the garden still needs tending. You do not scold a garden for growing weeds after the first weeding. You simply return, gently, and pull them again, and again, and this returning, this quiet, unglamorous returning, is itself the discipline Florence Scovel Shinn was pointing toward. Sixth, consider what rises in its place. Because dissolution without replacement leaves a person feeling empty rather than free. So as the old identity fades, you begin, deliberately, to describe yourself differently. Not, "I am struggling," but "I am provided for." Not, "I never have enough," but "I am one to whom supply comes easily." You say this even when it feels borrowed, even when it feels slightly too large for you. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that we grow into the language we are willing to speak before we fully believe it. The self-concept always arrives dressed a little ahead of the evidence. This is not deception, it is construction. You are not lying about who you are. You are describing who you actually are, underneath the old borrowed costume. And every night you fall asleep repeating, I am paid in full. You are not wishing something false into being. You are stripping something false away to reveal what was true the entire time. The debtor was never the real you. The paid in full self is not a fantasy you are inventing. It is the original you, standing quietly underneath all that borrowed fear, waiting this whole time to be recognized. The debtor in me is dissolved. The paid one remains. If this teaching is settling into you, subscribe so the next one finds you. Gently stay close tonight. There is more, waiting quietly ahead. The fifth key is, let gratitude be the seal you press onto supply before it has even fully arrived. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that gratitude is not merely good manners toward the universe. It is a technical function. It is the very motion that closes the circuit between the unseen and the seen. Most people wait to feel grateful until after the check clears, and by then, gratitude has lost its structural work. It has become a decoration instead of a mechanism. It is not a thank you offered after the fact. It is a key turned before the door has even visibly opened. Think of a man who was late on rent and, instead of pacing the apartment reciting every reason to panic, sat quietly for a few minutes and said, "Thank you that I am provided for. Thank you that this is already handled." He did not know how. He simply refused to withhold his gratitude as a hostage until the evidence showed up. And within days, in a way he could not have planned, the exact amount he needed arrived through an unexpected channel. This is not superstition. It is the plain mechanics of a state of consciousness completing itself. Consider also an ordinary woman standing at a grocery checkout. Watching the total climb higher than she expected, the old habit would be to tense, to apologize inwardly to her own wallet. But instead she breathes and whispers, "Thank you that I am always provided for, even here, even now." And something in her shoulders releases before the card is even swiped. She is not thanking the machine for a discount that has not appeared. She is thanking the unseen supply that stands behind every seen transaction. Gratitude spoken this way is not naive. It is precise. It says, I am not waiting for supply to convince me it exists. I already know it exists, and I am simply acknowledging what is already true. It is not the size of the thanks that matters. A whispered gratitude counts exactly as much as a shouted one. It is the timing that matters, offered before the proof rather than after it. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn so often spoke of praising the very increase you desire while it is still invisible. Because praise given early is praise that builds, while praise given late is only praise that comments. So tonight, before you sleep, do not save your thanks for tomorrow's proof. Spend it now, generously, on what you have already claimed. Let your gratitude go out ahead of you, like a servant sent to prepare the room, so that when supply itself arrives, it finds the welcome already standing at the door. I thank the unseen ledger before the check arrives. The sixth key is, treat your pillow, quite literally, as an altar, rather than merely a place to escape the day. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the moments right before sleep are sacred, not because they are quiet, but because they are undefended. All day long you guard your beliefs the way a person guards a door, checking every thought that tries to enter, weighing it, questioning it, sometimes turning it away entirely. But at night, that guard grows tired and finally sits down. And whatever thought is standing closest to the door in that final moment simply walks in unchallenged. Most people never notice this threshold exists at all. They treat the bed as nothing more than the place where the body finally collapses after the day has used it up. And because they see it that way, they hand it nothing sacred. They scroll their phones until their eyes simply give out. feeding the very last moments of their conscious day to comparison, to other people's vacations, other people's raises, other people's ease, and then they wonder why they wake up feeling slightly poorer than when they lay down. But you can choose differently. You can treat the 10 minutes before sleep the way a person treats the final moments before stepping into a temple. Deliberately, reverently, without distraction, think for a moment of the old altars. Long before they were ever used for anything sacred, they had to be tended. Someone had to clear away the debris, sweep the stone, remove what did not belong there, before anything of worth could ever be placed upon it. Your bed is no different, and tonight you are the one doing the tending. You might light a lamp instead of a screen. You might simply lie still in the dark and let one sentence be the whole of your prayer. I am paid in full, spoken not with strain, but the way you might say it, to an old and trusted friend who already believes you without needing convincing. Consider first what surrounds most beds, without anyone ever choosing it on purpose. The charger cable tangled beside the pillow, the mail still sitting on the nightstand, the television left muttering its evening news about markets and shortages into a half-asleep room. None of this was ever decided deliberately. It simply accumulated, the way clutter always accumulates when nothing sacred has been declared over a space. And Florence Scovel Shinn would ask you gently, would you let a stranger walk into a temple and set down whatever they liked upon the altar? Of course you would not. And yet this is exactly what we allow every single night when we let the day's leftover noise be the last thing laid down beside us. Consider second an ordinary couple, married many years, sharing the very same bedroom, yet keeping two entirely different altars, without ever naming it that way. He falls asleep most nights with the small blue light of his phone still glowing against his face, thumb moving through headlines about rising prices and tightening markets, and he carries that exact tightness, unfinished and humming, straight into his dreams. She, in the same bed, beside the very same walls, developed a small habit years earlier almost by accident. She turns her phone face down before her head ever touches the pillow, and she says, quietly, only to the dark, I am provided for. This house is provided for. Nothing about their outer circumstances differs. Same roof, same income, same bills stacked in the same kitchen drawer, and yet morning after morning he wakes already tired, in a way sleep never seems to touch. And she wakes rested in a way that has nothing to do with how many hours she slept. 2 people, 1 room, 2 altars, and 2 entirely different harvests, quietly growing from what each of them laid down the night before. Consider third, a man who used to fall asleep with his phone still glowing against his chest. The last thing he saw each night, some stranger's new car, some old classmate's promotion, some headline about the economy tightening its grip, and the last feeling he carried across the threshold was always the same quiet ache of not enough. One evening, almost on impulse, he set the phone face down on the dresser across the room, out of reach, out of sight, and instead he lit a small lamp beside the bed and lay there in that soft light, saying nothing more than, I am paid in full, all is well. At first it felt almost silly to him, an empty little ritual performed for no one, but he kept doing it, night after night, not because he felt different yet, but because he had decided the altar deserved tending, whether or not he felt anything at all, and slowly, without any single dramatic night to point to, he noticed his mornings had changed. The ache was simply gone, not fought, not defeated, just gone, the way frost disappears once the sun has quietly done its work. This is the order Florence Scovel Shinn taught. The altar comes first. The feeling follows the altar, not the other way around. You do not wait to feel reverent before you make the room reverent. You make the room reverent. On purpose, with your own 2 hands, and the feeling arrives afterward the way warmth arrives after a fire is lit, rather than before it. It is not the fire waiting on your mood. It is your mood finally catching up to the fire. If tonight you notice resistance, a voice that says, "This is only a bed, only a mattress and a blanket, nothing holy about it," let that voice speak, and then gently set it aside, the same way you would set aside a coat that no longer fits. Because the holiness was never in the fabric or the frame, it was always in the attention you bring to the threshold. Pause for a moment right now, and picture your own bed exactly as it is tonight. Notice what usually surrounds it: the phone, the pile of mail, the muttering television left on for background noise, and simply decide, quietly, that one thing will be different tonight. One small clearing will be made. Move the phone to the dresser. Dim the light. Let the last sound in the room be your own voice, rather than a stranger's headline. Treat your bed as holy ground tonight, not because the room itself is special, but because the state you carry into it becomes the seed for everything that grows tomorrow. And once you understand your bed this way, you begin to understand that every single night of your life has secretly been an altar all along. Whether you tended it or not, something was always being laid upon it. The only difference now is that you finally know it, and knowing it, you can finally choose, deliberately, tenderly, night after night, exactly what gets laid upon your altar before you close your eyes. My bed is holy ground where old accounts are closed. The seventh key is, understand fully that the hour of sleep is the hour of transfer. And I want to unfold this one slowly with you, piece by piece, because it is the deepest teaching we will sit with tonight. First, consider the most ordinary picture you can imagine. A small shop owner locks the front door at the end of a long day, counts the register, zips the day's earnings into a plain bag, and walks a few quiet blocks to the bank. The lobby is dark. The tellers went home hours ago. There is no line, no clerk waiting to inspect what she brings, only a narrow metal slot in the wall, a night depository, and she simply slides the bag through. No negotiation, no explanation required, no one questioning whether she deserves what she earned. The slot accepts it exactly as it is handed over, and by the time the sun rises and the first teller unlocks the doors, that deposit has already been logged, already counted, already quietly working its way into her account, before she has even had her coffee. Florence Scovel Shinn would want you to see this picture clearly, because your sleep works precisely like that night depository. Second, consider what this means for you personally. All day long you deal with tellers, so to speak, the doubting glance of a coworker, the calculator in your own head running numbers, the part of your mind that cross-examines every hopeful thought before it is allowed through the window. But at night, that whole department closes. The analytical teller goes home. The argumentative clerk locks up and leaves. And all that remains open is the slot in the wall, the deep receiving place that does not interrogate what you hand it. It simply accepts the deposit and begins processing. This is why the sentence you carry to sleep matters more than almost any sentence you speak all day, because there is no one standing at that window to challenge it. Third, consider very honestly what you have been depositing most nights without realizing it. Imagine that same shop owner, instead of a bag of earnings, walks to the bank each night with a bag of unpaid invoices, overdue notices, and worried scraps of paper, and slides that through the slot instead. She would never do this with her actual business. She knows better than to deposit her debts into the very system meant to grow her wealth. And yet this is exactly what so many of us do with our minds every single night. We lie down and slide the day's fear through the slot, the tight month, the argument about money, the comparison to someone else's raise, and then we are surprised when the account we wake into the next morning looks like exactly what we deposited. The subconscious mind does not sort through your bag and discard the bad parts. It simply processes what it was handed, faithfully, without judgment. So the deposit you choose tonight is not a small decision. It is the literal content of tomorrow's ledger. Fourth, consider why one deposit alone, rarely changes everything, and why this is not a discouragement, but actually good news. A single deposit into any account, however meaningful, is still just one entry, but a nightly deposit, made faithfully, night after night, behaves the way compound interest behaves in an actual bank. It does not merely add, it accumulates upon itself. Each night's deposit of, "I am paid in full," is not standing alone, it is stacking on top of the deposit from the night before. And the night before that, quietly gathering weight and momentum in a ledger you cannot see with your natural eyes, but which is nonetheless entirely real. This is precisely what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she taught that the word, spoken faithfully and repeatedly, becomes flesh. It is not one grand declaration that moves mountains. It is the modest, steady, nightly deposit that eventually becomes an account too large for the old poverty to touch. Fifth, let me walk you through what this can actually look like across a single ordinary week, because teaching without a picture tends to evaporate by morning. Imagine that same shop owner, Monday night, she is tired, and out of old habit she almost slides worry through the slot, catches herself halfway, and manages only a tired whisper, paid in full. It does not feel powerful yet, it feels almost mechanical. But she deposits it anyway. Tuesday night. She remembers a little sooner, before the worry even fully forms, and the sentence comes slightly easier. Wednesday night. Something shifts. She notices she is not gritting her teeth to say it. She is simply saying it. The way you say goodnight to someone you love without needing to convince yourself you love them. Thursday night arrives after a hard day, a slow day at the shop, fewer customers than she hoped, and the old fear tries to rush the slot first. But she has made enough deposits by now that the newer sentence is closer to the surface, so it wins the moment, almost without a struggle. Friday night, she lies down and realizes, almost with surprise, that she feels lighter than the week's numbers alone would explain. Nothing dramatic has happened yet in her outer account, and yet something in her has clearly changed. This is the compounding at work, unseen, unhurried, entirely real. Sixth, consider why this transfer requires no witness and no permission. During the day, if you tried to declare abundance out loud in front of a doubting relative or a skeptical coworker, you might feel exposed, foolish, in need of defending yourself. But the night depository has no audience. No one is standing in that dark lobby, watching you slide your deposit through the slot. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this privacy is not incidental. It is essential. The deepest transfers of consciousness happen exactly where no one is present to argue with them. This is precisely why the hour of sleep carries more building power than 100 daytime affirmations recited with one eye on who might be listening. At night, it is only you, and the slot, and the sentence you choose to hand over. Seventh, consider a second picture now. A different depositor entirely. An old farmer who each evening walked the length of his field before turning in for the night. And in his hand he carried a small sack of seed, not to plant it, the planting season was long past, but simply to feel its weight, to remind himself, one more time before sleep, that the harvest was already promised in the sack he held. He did not stand in the field arguing with the empty rows about how bare they looked under the darkening sky. He did not recite the disappointments of last season or calculate how many more seasons he had left to try again. He simply held what was already true in his hand, the seed, the promise, the certainty, and walked back inside satisfied. This is worth sitting with, because so many of us stand in the empty field of our current circumstance, staring at bare rows, when we could simply be holding the seed, the sentence, the quiet certainty, and letting that be enough for the night. It is not the bare field that determines the harvest. It is the seed already resting in the hand of the one who trusts it. Eighth, consider also why so many people make a deposit one night and then, unable to bear the silence of not yet seeing it counted, rush back the very next morning to check the vault, prying at the slot, demanding an early receipt. This is understandable, but it is also precisely what interrupts the work. A depositor who trusts the bank does not stand outside all night, with her ear pressed to the wall, listening for the sound of her own money being counted. She trusts the system enough to walk home and sleep, and it is that very trust, that willingness to release the deposit completely once it has been made, that allows the transfer to proceed undisturbed. Anxious checking is simply another form of doubt wearing the costume of diligence, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that doubt, however well disguised, is still doubt, still a hand reaching back through the slot to take back what was just given. Ninth, consider the quiet discipline this asks of you. Not perfection, never perfection. Some nights the old worry will still slip through first. Some nights you will catch yourself halfway to sleep, still running numbers instead of resting in the promise. This is not failure. It is simply the old teller trying to reopen for one more transaction out of habit. Notice it gently, without scolding yourself, and simply make the correction. Slide the true deposit through after all. Even a late deposit still counts. Even an imperfect night still compounds. The bank does not close its doors to you because last night's deposit was a little unsteady. It simply continues faithfully processing whatever you bring it, night after night, patiently, the way Florence Scovel Shinn always described the deeper mind. Faithful, tireless, entirely without judgment. 10th, consider a very ordinary household to see how differently two people in the very same conditions can handle this same hour. Two co-workers, employed at the very same company, facing the very same uncertain quarter, the same whispered talk of layoffs drifting through the break room all week long. The first co-worker brings his fear home each evening, the way some men bring home their briefcase without ever setting it down. He lies in bed, reviewing every rumor, rehearsing what he would say if he lost the position, building, brick by brick, an entire imagined catastrophe before he has even been told anything at all, and he deposits that whole imagined disaster through the slot every single night, faithfully, without meaning to. The second co-worker hears the very same rumors, feels, if she is honest, the very same flicker of fear rise in her chest during the day. But before sleep, she sets it down deliberately and says, only to herself, I am provided for regardless of what this company decides. My supply is not limited to one address, and she deposits that instead. 3 months later, when the layoffs do finally come, the first man is devastated in every sense. The job was the whole of his identity, and now the identity is gone with it. But the second woman, though she too loses the position, finds within weeks an opportunity she would never have gone looking for on her own, one that pays her better and asks more of her gifts. The outer event was identical for both of them. The same morning, the same notice, the same walk to the same parking lot, carrying the same small box of belongings, but the accounts they had been building in secret for 3 months were entirely different. And it was those secret accounts, not the shared outer event, that determined what each of them found waiting on the other side of it. 11th, consider that the slot itself never once asks whether the circumstances justify the deposit. It does not check the news. It does not consult the economy. It does not require the bill to be smaller before it will accept a peaceful sentence in its place. This is precisely the mercy of it. You are never disqualified from making a good deposit simply because the day was a hard one. In fact, the hard days are exactly when the deposit matters most, because a peaceful sentence handed over on an easy day proves very little, but a peaceful sentence handed over on a day when everything seemed to argue against it, that is the deposit that truly builds the account. 12th, consider one last time the shape of the whole practice, so it settles clearly before we move on. The day is for living. The night is for depositing. The day may hand you news you did not choose, a bill you did not expect, a rumor you cannot control, but the night is entirely yours to govern. No manager, no market, No headline is standing at that slot beside you, only you, and the sentence you have decided to carry across the threshold. So tonight, as you feel sleep beginning to draw near, picture it plainly if it helps you. Picture the quiet lobby, the dark windows, the single open slot, and picture yourself walking up, unhurried, without shame, without needing anyone's approval, carrying whatever the day handed you, the tight month, the long list, the tired shoulders, and choosing, deliberately, to leave all of that at the door, and sliding through the one sentence worth depositing above all others, not the bill, not the argument, not the comparison, only this, paid in full, and then simply walking away, unhurried, empty-handed in the best possible way, letting the vault do what vaults are built to do, while I rest. Heaven settles what I could not force. The eighth key is, understand that the state you wake into is not an accident. It is proof. It is the receipt printed by whatever you handed the night before. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the first few minutes after waking are almost as sacred as the last few minutes before sleep, because in that half-awake space, before the day's noise rushes in, whatever was built overnight briefly shows itself clearly, before you have a single argument to make for or against it, before your defenses are back at their post. And this is exactly why so many people miss it entirely. They wake and immediately reach for their phone, and within seconds they have handed their fragile new morning over to comparison, to bad news, to somebody else's version of success. And the calm that was quietly built overnight gets buried again before it ever had a chance to stand up and walk around the room. It is not that the peace failed to arrive, it is that it was never given a moment to be noticed. First, consider what it actually means for a morning to be a receipt rather than a fresh, unrelated event. A receipt does not create the purchase, it only confirms one that already happened. So when you wake tense, that tension is not new information about your worth or your future. It is simply confirmation of what was handed to your consciousness the night before. And when you wake light, unhurried, almost amused at how quiet your own mind feels, that too is only a receipt. Nothing more mysterious than that. This reframe alone changes everything, because it means you are never truly at the mercy of how you happen to wake. You are only ever reading yesterday's order form, and if you do not like what the receipt says, the answer was never to fight the receipt. The answer is to change tonight's order. Second, consider a woman who used to wake already tired from bracing, her jaw tight before her eyes even opened, her mind reaching for the day's list of worries before her feet had touched the floor. She did not know why mornings felt like starting a race already behind, until she realized she had never once given herself a single unclaimed minute at the threshold of waking. The moment her eyes opened, the old debtor voice was simply standing there waiting, first in line, because nothing else had been placed ahead of it, so she began one small habit. Before her feet touched the floor, before any screen touched her eyes, she would lie still for one more minute and ask herself gently, what does a person who is paid in full feel like right now? And then she would feel it, on purpose, deliberately, the way you might try on a garment before deciding to wear it out into the world. And she noticed, gradually, that her morning stopped feeling like the start of a battle and started feeling like the continuation of a peace that had never actually left her. Third, consider how ordinary this practice can be and how little it asks of you. You do not need a long ritual. You do not need candles or silence or a perfect room. You need only that one unclaimed minute. Lying still, eyes closed a moment longer, and a single sentence offered quietly to yourself before the world gets its turn. Still paid in full, still provided for, said the way you might greet an old and trusted friend who never once doubted you. This is not a performance for the day ahead. It is simply a private confirmation, spoken to the only person in the room who needs to hear it. Fourth, consider what it means when this practice is skipped. And here I want to be gentle with you, because if you wake anxious more mornings than not, This is not a character flaw. It is not proof that you are somehow bad at this. It is simply information. It tells you plainly what was handed to the workshop the night before, and it is never too late to hand it something else tonight. The morning is not the judge of you, it is only the mirror, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a mirror can be changed the moment you change what stands in front of it. You do not scold a mirror for the reflection it shows, you simply adjust what you are holding up to it. Fifth, consider an ordinary week lived this way, because a single morning proves little, but a week begins to speak. Picture a shopkeeper again, this time in the morning rather than the evening. Monday she wakes and forgets entirely, reaches for the phone out of pure habit, and the old tightness is back in her shoulders. Before she has even sat up, she notices it later, at breakfast, and simply says to herself, "Tomorrow I will remember." Tuesday, she remembers halfway through reaching for the phone, and sets it back down, and gives herself the one unclaimed minute, still paid in full. It feels a little forced, a little like reciting lines, but she says it anyway. Wednesday, the minute comes easier. She does not have to remind herself twice. Thursday, she wakes before the alarm even sounds, lying quietly in the grey early light, and the sentence is already there, waiting. Gentle, unforced, like a friend who let herself in with her own key. Friday morning arrives after a hard week, and she half expects the old bracing to return. But it does not come as strongly, because 5 mornings of unclaimed minutes have quietly built a different first response. This is the pattern Florence Scovel Shinn pointed toward, not a single triumphant sunrise, but an accumulation of small, unremarkable ones. Sixth, consider the wider architecture this begins to build across weeks, rather than a single morning, because one calm waking proves very little, but a week of them begins to feel like evidence, a month of them begins to feel like character, and eventually, without any dramatic turning point you can point back to, you simply become someone who wakes, expecting good, rather than someone who wakes, bracing for lack. This is the quiet architecture Florence Scovel Shinn described. Not a single miracle morning, but an accumulation of ordinary ones, each ordinary morning laying one more thin, steady layer over the old anxious waking until it simply cannot be found underneath anymore. It is not the loud, dramatic morning that changes a life. It is the plain, unremarkable one, repeated, until it becomes the only kind you know, and when that happens, you will not announce it to anyone. You will simply notice, one ordinary Tuesday, that you forgot to brace, and that forgetting will be the surest proof of all. I meet each morning already reseated, already free. The 9th key is, know, finally, that you are becoming the one to whom paid in full is simply the ordinary truth, not a phrase you must strain to believe, but a quiet fact. You have grown into the way a tree grows into its own height, without announcement, without effort, simply by continuing faithfully in the direction it was always meant to reach. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that supply is not drawn to those who beg loudest or worry hardest. It is drawn to those who have become, in their own private consciousness, a place where lack no longer has lodging. Think of it like a home. If a home is always cluttered with old bills spread across the table, unopened mail piling in the corner, tension humming in every room, that home does not easily receive new gifts. There is nowhere clean to set them down, but a home that has been cleared, aired out, made ready, becomes a home that guests are glad to enter and glad to leave gifts within. Consider a man who spent years living, quite literally, out of boxes. He told himself it was temporary. He had moved into the house years before and simply never unpacked the last few crates. They sat in the hallway, and every day he stepped around them without quite seeing them anymore. One afternoon, a friend visiting asked gently, "Why are you still living like you might have to leave any moment?" And something in him went still, because that question was not really about boxes. It was about a self that had never quite believed it was allowed to fully arrive anywhere. Not in that house. And not in supply either. He had been affirming abundance for months, faithfully, nightly, and yet some quiet part of him kept living out of boxes anyway, half settled, half braced. That week he finally unpacked the last crate, folded it flat, and something shifted that no affirmation alone had reached. He was no longer merely visiting his own home, he was living in it. And this, Florence Scovel Shinn would say, is exactly what must happen inside you, with paid in full. It cannot remain a phrase you take out for special occasions and put carefully back in its box when the bill arrives. It must become the address you actually live at, the place your mind returns to by default, without ceremony, the way you return home each evening without needing to remind yourself where home is. You have spent these hours tonight doing exactly this kind of unpacking, catching the careless word, claiming the state before the proof, letting the deeper mind receive undisturbed, letting the old debtor identity dissolve, sealing it all with gratitude, treating your rest as an altar, trusting the transfer that happens while you sleep, waking already receipted, and now, simply. This last key asks you to stop moving between two houses, the old cramped one built from worry, and the new spacious one you have been visiting only in your better moments. Choose the new one as your only address. Tell no one else where the old house is. Stop keeping a key to it in your pocket out of habit. Let it fall into disrepair from simple neglect, because you are not coming back. This is not a performance you put on for one grateful evening and then wander away from into the old apartment of worry by morning. It is an identity you are quietly, permanently settling into, the way a person finally, fully moves in. Supply now recognizes me as one who is paid in full. Here is the whole picture. Every key we opened tonight was never really 9 separate keys. It was one key, turned 9 different ways in the light so you could see every angle of it. It is not the balance in the account that decides your peace. It is the state you occupy that eventually decides the balance. It is not the loud daytime affirmation that does the deepest work. It is the quiet, uncontested sentence spoken at the threshold of sleep. It is not effort that pays the old accounts. It is identity. The debtor self was never the truth of you, and letting it dissolve was never a loss. It was only the return of something borrowed. Gratitude was never a reward you gave after supply arrived. It was the seal that let supply arrive at all. Your bed was never merely furniture. It has been an altar this entire time, whether you knew it or not. And the morning you wake into has never been random. It has only ever been the receipt of whatever you planted the night before. 1 key, 9 turns, and the door it opens has always simply said, paid in full. If what you have received tonight has stirred something quiet and steady in you, I want to invite you gently into the Overflow Covenant. It is a 30-day journey of daily readings and evening practices built entirely on Florence Scovel Shinn's own teaching, designed to carry this same work forward, one night at a time, until paid in full is no longer something you must remind yourself of, but simply the address where you live. It is available today for a gift of $27, fully covered by a 30-day guarantee, so there is truly nothing to risk here, only something to receive. You will find the link in the description just below this video, and I ask only that you open it the way you would open a gift, with open hands, not grasping ones. Say it once more with me now, as you let your eyes close tonight. Every debt dissolves in the presence of divine substance. I am paid in full while I rest. My word is my wand, and as you drift, let that be the last sentence you carry across the threshold. Not the bill, not the worry, only this: paid in full, paid in full. Sleep sweetly tonight, knowing the account was never as far behind as it appeared. It was only ever waiting for you to speak it whole. Say this one sentence before bed for a financial miracle. Florence Scovel Shinn, taught that the words you speak in the last waking moment of your day are the seeds you hand to the gardener of your own subconscious, and that gardener never sleeps even when you do. There is a verse tucked into the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, verse 24, that has quietly been waiting for you your whole life. It reads, "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear." Sit with that for one moment. The answer is already moving toward you, before the question has even finished leaving your lips. Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? This is not a promise about someday. This is a description of a supply system so immediate that your calling and its answering happen almost in the same breath. And yet so many of us have been taught the opposite. We have been taught to strive, to chase, to work ourselves into exhaustion, trying to force supply to notice us, when the whole time supply was already leaning in to hear us the moment we opened our mouths. The very way you have been taught to get your miracle, through worry, through pushing, through staying up turning the bill over and over in your mind, is the exact thing standing between you and the miracle itself. So before we go further, let us give your subconscious something better to hold on to tonight than fear. Say it with me. I speak my word in peace. Supply answers me before I finish asking. My word is my wand. Again, I speak my word in peace. Supply answers me before I finish asking. My word is my wand. Now, if something in you just went quiet when you said that, you are not imagining it, and you are not the only one who has spent years falling asleep, rehearsing lack instead of rehearsing supply. So before we open the keys tonight, type the two words, God supplies, right into the comments below. Let it be your seal. Let it be the one true sentence your fingers speak, even before your lips speak the rest. The first key is that your last words at night are not idle chatter, they are instructions. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the subconscious is deeply obedient. It does not argue with you. It does not weigh your evidence. It simply takes whatever you hand it in that drowsy borderland between waking and sleep, and goes to work making it so. Most people hand it their bank balance, their unpaid bill, their fear of tomorrow, and then they wonder why tomorrow arrives wearing the same tired face as yesterday. But you are going to hand it something else tonight. You are going to hand it one sentence, spoken quietly, almost like a lullaby to your own soul. Something such as, I am one with infinite supply, and infinite supply flows to me now. Notice there is no pleading in that sentence, no bargaining, no long explanation of why you deserve it. It is simply a statement of fact, spoken as though it is already so, because in consciousness, it already is. Think of a woman lying awake, replaying an overdue invoice in her mind. Every time she closes her eyes, the number floats up again, and every morning she wakes more tired and more convinced that she is behind. Now imagine instead she spends those same 60 seconds saying, quietly, my supply is secure. My word is my wand. She is not denying the invoice exists. She is simply refusing to let it be the last voice heard by her own subconscious before it goes to work all night long. And here is another picture worth holding. Think of a man who falls asleep every night replaying an argument from years ago, rehearsing what he should have said, rehearsing the unfairness of it. He wonders why that same tight feeling greets him every single morning before his feet even touch the floor. It is not mystery, it is simply obedience. His subconscious has been faithfully repeating back to him exactly what he handed it the night before. So faithfully, in fact, that it has never once questioned whether the story was worth repeating. This is what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she said the subconscious has no sense of humor and no sense of proportion. It does not sort your instructions into important and unimportant. It simply carries out whatever arrives last, with total loyalty, whether that instruction serves you or quietly harms you. Consider also a young father who spends his last waking minutes each night scrolling through job listings that all feel just out of reach, filling his mind before sleep with an inventory of everything he does not yet have, and then wonders in the morning why the day feels heavy before it has even properly begun. The morning he woke into was quietly assembled the night before, out of exactly the material he handed over at the door of sleep. This is not punishment, and it is not bad luck. It is simply the subconscious keeping its faithful promise to build tomorrow out of whatever seed tonight provided it, which means the moment he changes the seed, he changes what tomorrow is permitted to build. This is why it is never really about how hard you have prayed during the day, or how many affirmations you managed to squeeze in between errands. It is about which voice you allowed to speak last, right before the door of the conscious mind quietly closes for the night. It is not effort during daylight that shapes your night. It is the last sentence spoken at the threshold of sleep. This is the whole secret hiding in plain sight. You get to choose which voice gets the last word, and whichever voice speaks last is the one that grows overnight like a seed left in warm soil. So tonight, before you let your eyes close, ask yourself gently which voice you are about to hand the keys of your own mind to for the next 8 hours, and then choose, quietly, deliberately, the one voice worth trusting with the whole night. I choose my words with care, and I let them be the last voice my soul hears tonight. The second key is that the subconscious mind works like a garden that never rests. Even while your body lies perfectly still, Florence Scovel Shinn often described the subconscious as fertile soil that receives whatever seed you drop into it, without asking whether the seed is a fear or a faith. It simply grows what it is given, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, because the soil itself has no opinion. It does not pause to consider whether your worry is justified or whether your faith is warranted. It does not sort the worthy seed from the unworthy one. It simply receives whatever is pressed into it with feeling and quietly begins the long, patient work of making that seed into a harvest. This is why she taught that a single sentence, repeated with feeling at the edge of sleep, can do more work in 8 hours of rest than 8 hours of frantic daytime striving, because in sleep, the analytical mind steps aside. The arguing mind steps aside. The mind that likes to weigh evidence and demand proof steps aside, and the deeper mind is left alone in the quiet, with nothing else to do but tend to whatever you handed it last. Picture a small shopkeeper who closes his register every night, worried he will not make rent. He counts his losses out loud to his wife. He adds up the empty hours of the afternoon. He rehearses the customers who did not come, and he falls asleep still counting, still adding, still rehearsing, and month after month rent remains exactly the struggle he keeps planting it to be. Now picture him instead closing the register and saying quietly to himself, "My business is a channel for infinite supply, and supply flows through me easily." Nothing about his shelves changed overnight. The same stock sits in the same aisles, and yet slowly his customers increase. His ideas sharpen. An opportunity appears that he would have been too anxious to notice before. This is not superstition. This is the plain mechanics of a mind that has been given new instructions and has quietly gone to work, carrying them out exactly the way it was told. Consider, too, a mother lying awake calculating, years in advance, how she will ever afford her children's education, adding imaginary tuition bills in the dark long before a single one has actually arrived. She is planting a harvest of dread for a season that has not even come yet, and the soil, faithful as always, begins quietly growing exactly that. Now imagine her instead saying, softly, "Supply always meets the need at the moment the need arrives," and releasing the calculation for the night. She has not become careless about the future. She has simply stopped forcing her subconscious to farm a field of fear 10 years before harvest season. And a strange calm often follows a woman who finally allows tomorrow to be handled by the same supply that has always handled today. And here is the part most people miss entirely. A garden cannot grow a harvest of peace from a bed of 6 different worries planted in 6 different corners the same night. Imagine a gardener who plants tomatoes on Monday, pulls them up Tuesday to plant beans instead, pulls those up Wednesday out of doubt, and scatters a handful of frightened seeds across the whole plot on Thursday just to see what might come up faster. Nothing in that soil ever gets the chance to root. And it is not because the soil failed him. It is because he never once gave it the same seed twice in a row long enough for it to take hold. This is exactly what happens when you fall asleep one night affirming supply, and the very next night rehearsing the same tired fear you were trying to release. The garden cannot sort your confusion for you. It simply grows whatever you leave behind when you turn out the light, faithfully, without judgment, without asking whether you meant it this time. So tonight, choose one sentence, and let it be the only seed you plant. Do not plant 3 different worries, and 1 hurried prayer, and expect a harvest of peace from soil so divided against itself. Let the same seed go in night after night, plainly, quietly, without needing to be shouted or perfected, because belief grows stronger. Every single night you keep watering the same seed, instead of digging it up out of fear, to check whether it has taken root yet. It is not effort that grows your supply while you sleep. It is the seed you were faithful enough to plant only once, night after night, the very same seed. I plant 1 seed of supply tonight, and I trust the quiet dark to grow it well. The third key is that sleep itself is a small nightly surrender, a gentle laying down of the tired, anxious self so that a fresher, truer self can rise in the morning. And here Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching touches something almost sacred. She spoke of an old, fearful self that must be let go of again and again before the real self, the one already whole and richly supplied, is free to come forward. And let us be very clear about what this means, because it is not a frightening thing, it is a merciful thing. Nothing about you is ending. No part of your life is being taken away. It is only the tired identity, the one who learned somewhere along the way that there is never quite enough, that must quietly step down each night, so the true self underneath, the one who has always belonged to infinite supply, can finally take its place. This is not loss, it is release. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this release is one of the gentlest and most overlooked doorways to a changed life. Think for a moment of a man who has spent years believing he is simply behind on the bills, behind on his savings, behind on his own life compared to everyone around him. He carries this belief into every waking hour, without even naming it. He carries it into meetings, into conversations, into the quiet moment he opens his wallet in front of a cashier. And each night he carries it to bed with him too, lying there rehearsing the very same tiredness that has followed him all day. But suppose, just once, before closing his eyes, he says quietly, "I release the self who believed he was behind, and I welcome the self who has always been enough." Nothing outside him changes in that instant. The bills are still the bills, and yet something underneath him has shifted its footing, because he has just given his own subconscious a permission it may never have been given before. Permission to let an old identity finally rest. Think also of how ordinary this pattern already is in nature. A snake does not fight to keep its old skin. It simply lets it fall away because it has grown into something new underneath. A caterpillar does not march into its cocoon and march back out unchanged. Something in it rests completely, something in it lets go completely, and something else entirely steps into the light. And think even of the seasons themselves. Autumn does not apologize for the leaves it lets fall. It simply lets them go, quietly, without struggle, because it already knows spring is waiting on the other side of that release. You are not being asked to do anything stranger than what the whole natural world already does quietly every single day. You are only being asked to let your bedtime sentence be the small permission that lets the old, tired self stop working the night shift, so that the true self, the one who was never actually poor, never actually behind, never actually forgotten by supply, can finally come forward and rest instead. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this true self has been there all along, patiently waiting underneath every fear you ever rehearsed. It is not something you must build from nothing. It is something you must simply stop covering over each night with the same old anxious costume. It is not a new self you are manufacturing through effort. It is the real self finally being allowed to surface once the false one steps aside. This is the quiet difference between striving and surrendering. Striving tries to force a new identity into being through sheer willpower. Surrendering simply lets the true one, already whole, already provided for, rise up on its own the moment the old one is no longer clung to. So when you say, "Before sleep, I release the self who feared lack, and I welcome the self who knows supply," you are not being poetic, and you are not performing a small ritual for its own sake. You are giving very specific and literal instructions to the part of your mind that quietly rebuilds your entire outlook while you rest. This is why some mornings feel lighter for no visible reason at all. Nothing outside changed overnight. The bill is still on the counter, the balance is still what it was, and yet something inside feels different, calmer, steadier, and it is not chance. It is the direct result of the release you spoke before you closed your eyes. Tonight, let the old fearful self quietly step aside, not with struggle, not with force, simply with permission. And let the truer, richer self, the one who has been waiting patiently this whole time, finally get a turn. I let the tired self rest tonight, and I rise tomorrow as the self who has always been supplied. The fourth key is that this one bedtime sentence only becomes powerful when it is echoed quietly across the ordinary hours of your day. Because Florence Scovel Shinn never taught that a single nighttime whisper works alone in a vacuum. She taught that consciousness is built the way a house is built, one small, honest beam laid upon another, and a house built with only one beam laid at midnight and nothing laid before it will not stand very long, no matter how beautifully that one beam was cut. So let us walk through an entire ordinary day together and notice how many quiet chances you already have to reinforce the very sentence you plan to speak tonight. Picture your alarm sounding at 7 in the morning. Your very first thought, before your feet even touch the floor, is often the truest mirror of your consciousness. If that first thought is a sigh about the day ahead, that sigh has already begun laying a beam of lack before breakfast is even made. So instead, the moment your eyes open, you say quietly, "This day supplies me richly." Notice nothing outside you has changed yet, but something inside you has already shifted its footing. By 7:30, you are perhaps standing at the window watching the sky lighten. And here is a small thing most people never think to do. You let the light itself become a witness. You say, "As the sun rises without effort, so does my supply." By 8 in the morning, you are perhaps standing at the kitchen counter, looking at a stack of mail you have been avoiding. Here, Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly, do not let the mail speak first. You speak first. Place your hand lightly on the stack and say, "Every piece of this is handled by infinite supply," and open it in peace rather than dread. By 8:45, you are perhaps in the car or on the train, and the radio or a stranger's conversation mentions the economy, prices, some far-off trouble, and here is where most consciousness quietly leaks out unnoticed. Through the ears, through idle agreement with someone else's fear, so you gently withdraw your attention and repeat inwardly, "My supply does not depend on the economy. My supply depends on my word." By 9:30 you are at work, or searching for work, or tending your home, and a small worry drifts by. Perhaps a coworker mentions layoffs, or a neighbor mentions rising prices. This is the moment most people quietly hand their subconscious a fresh seed of fear without even noticing they did it. Instead, you pause for one breath and silently repeat your sentence. My supply is secure, regardless of what I hear around me. By 11. Consider a man at his desk who receives an email that makes his stomach drop, an unexpected expense, a client pulling out, a number smaller than he hoped for. This is not a small moment. This is the exact hinge on which an entire day can swing toward fear or remain anchored in faith. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that it is not the size of the disturbance that matters, but the speed with which you return your word to its rightful place. So this man closes his eyes for 3 seconds and says under his breath, "This does not change what already belongs to me." And something in his shoulders actually drops. The tightness leaves, and he goes back to his work, no longer carrying the email like a stone in his pocket. By noon, perhaps a bill arrives that is larger than expected. This is often the moment faith is tested most sharply, because it is easy to speak faith when nothing is threatening it. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the real proof of your growing consciousness is not how you feel in calm moments, but how quickly you can return to peace after a jolt. So you look at that bill, you breathe, and you say, "This bill does not frighten my supply. My supply is larger than any bill." By 1 in the afternoon, over lunch, a friend or a coworker begins to talk about money the way so many people do, comparing, complaining, quietly comparing their lack to someone else's apparent plenty. You do not need to correct them or preach at them. You simply decline to join the chorus. You let their words pass by like weather, and inwardly you say, "I bless their supply and I bless my own." This alone, this small, quiet refusal to add your voice to a chorus of scarcity, is worth more to your consciousness than an hour of formal affirmation. By mid-afternoon, fatigue may set in, and fatigue often whispers the oldest lie of all, that you are not enough, that you will never quite catch up. This is precisely where the sentence becomes a lifeline rather than a decoration. You repeat it not because you feel especially inspired, but because repetition itself is what carries a seed down into the soil where it can actually take root. Think of it the way a river is fed, not by one single dramatic storm, but by dozens of small, quiet streams trickling in from every direction all day long. Your bedtime sentence is the mouth of that river. But every one of these small daytime moments, the mail, the email, the overheard worry, the lunchtime comparison, the tired afternoon slump, is a stream feeding it, and by nightfall, the river that reaches your pillow is either swollen with faith because you fed it faith all day, or thinned out and muddy with fear because you let fear pour in unchallenged hour after hour. This is why some nights the bedtime sentence feels almost effortless to believe, and other nights it feels like pushing a boulder uphill. It was never really about that one moment at bedtime at all. It was about which streams you allowed to run freely all day long. By 4 in the afternoon, perhaps, you check your phone and see a notification that stings, an account balance, a price increase, a message you were dreading. And here Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching becomes almost tender in its practicality. She would say, "You are not required to feel nothing when you see it. You are only required to speak after the sting, rather than staying silent inside the sting. So you exhale and you say, 'Even this is passing through me on its way to my good.'" By 5, as the workday closes, take 15 seconds, just 15, and silently review the day the way you might glance back down a road you have just walked. Notice where you spoke faith, and notice where fear slipped through unnoticed. This is not for self-judgment. Florence Scovel Shinn never taught guilt. It is simply for gentle awareness, because awareness itself begins closing the leaks before you even try to fix them. By 6, as you prepare dinner, or close your laptop, or lock the front door, you take one still moment and you say the sentence once more, deliberately, slowly, letting yourself actually feel the words rather than rushing through them. By 7, perhaps you sit down to eat with someone you love, and the conversation turns, as it so often does, toward money worries. A repair that is needed, a price that went up again. This too is a small fork in the road. You can either let the meal become a courtroom where lack is put on trial all evening, or you can gently steer even that conversation back towards supply, saying simply, "We always find our way through. We always have." By 8, perhaps you take a short walk before the evening settles fully, and here you let the world itself preach the same sermon back to you. The streetlights that switch on without your help, the porches lit warmly one after another down the block. None of it earned through anxious effort, all of it simply provided, and you let that ordinary evening scenery quietly agree with your sentence rather than argue against it. And now here is the exercise. Pause for a moment right now and pick one real moment from your actual day this week. A phone call you dreaded, a receipt that startled you, a message that made your stomach tighten, and imagine yourself meeting that exact moment with your bedtime sentence instead of your old reflex of fear. Feel how different that single moment becomes when it is met with "my supply is secure" rather than met with silent panic. This is the whole practice in miniature, and if you can practice it in imagination now, you can practice it in reality the next time it happens. By the time night finally comes and you lie down, you are not handing your subconscious a foreign idea it has never met before. You are handing it a friend it has already spoken with a dozen times since morning. And this is precisely why the sentence spoken before bed becomes so quietly powerful. It is not one lonely whisper trying to outshout an entire day of fear. It is the final, warmest repetition of a truth you have already been practicing since your feet first touched the floor. Think of a choir standing in a great quiet hall. One single voice, singing alone into that vast empty space, can sound thin, almost lost, but the same voice singing as the last note of a chorus that has been building all day, joined by every smaller voice that agreed with it along the way, fills the entire hall without even trying. Your bedtime sentence is that final note, and the whole day was the choir gathering behind it. It is not the nighttime sentence alone that works the miracle. It is the nighttime sentence crowning an entire day that has quietly agreed with it. Tonight I gather every quiet moment of this day into one sentence, and I let that sentence be my rest. Breathe with me for just a moment here. If this teaching is doing something quiet and real in you right now, let it keep reaching you. Subscribe so the next teaching finds you gently right when you need it. The 5th key is short, and it is meant to be, because sometimes the truest teaching does not need to be long to be complete. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that faith is not a feeling you wait to arrive, it is a decision you make and then act on before the feeling ever shows up. So many people delay speaking their sentence at night because they do not yet feel convinced it is true. They lie there testing themselves, waiting for some warm rush of certainty before they will allow the words past their lips. And because that rush never comes on command, they simply stay silent, night after night, mistaking the absence of feeling for the absence of truth. But Florence Scovel Shinn would gently remind you that feeling convinced was never the requirement. Speaking it was. Think of a man standing at a light switch in an unfamiliar house at night. He does not wait until he feels certain the wiring is good before he flips it. He simply flips it, and the light itself is what answers his doubt. He does not need faith in the electricity. He only needs to move his hand. Your sentence works the very same way. You do not need to feel wealthy to say "I am supplied." You only need to say it, and let the saying itself begin turning the current on. Consider a woman named Marta who works at a small diner and counts her tips every night before bed, with a tight, worried feeling in her chest. One evening, she decides to try her sentence. "My supply flows to me now, and the moment it leaves her lips, it sounds almost silly to her, hollow, like a coin dropped into an empty jar. She is tempted right there to stop, to decide clearly this does not work for someone like her, but she keeps speaking it anyway, night after night, even while it still sounds hollow, even while nothing in her tip jar has changed, because Florence Scovel Shinn would tell her plainly that the hollow feeling is not proof of failure, it is simply the sound of an old habit being interrupted for the very first time. Feeling always arrives late. Feeling is the guest who shows up only after the door has already been opened. So do not wait at the door checking your emotions before you speak. Speak first, and let conviction follow quietly behind, like a slower friend catching up. Notice too that this is exactly backwards from how most of us were taught to live. We were taught to feel our way into belief, to wait for evidence before we dared to trust it. But supply does not wait for you to feel ready. Supply simply answers the word the moment it is spoken, with any sincerity at all. So speak tonight, even if your voice feels thin. Speak, even if the words feel borrowed. Speak the way Martha spoke, hollow at first, faithful anyway, and let the feeling arrive on its own schedule, rather than yours. Tonight, do not wait for certainty before you open your mouth. Certainty is not the invitation, it is the guest. I speak my word before I feel it, and the feeling always follows the word. The sixth key is that the sentence you speak must be released the moment it leaves your lips, not gripped, not monitored, not checked on nightly like a worried gardener, digging up the same seed again and again to see if it has sprouted yet. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that faith is the substance of things hoped for, and substance, by its very nature, is something solid enough to be set down and trusted to hold its own weight without your hand still wrapped around it. So many people speak a beautiful sentence before bed, and then 5 minutes later lie awake wondering whether it worked, checking their feelings the way you might check a pot on the stove every 10 seconds. And in doing so, they quietly plant a second, contradicting seed right on top of the first, doubt, right beside the faith they just spoke. And the garden cannot grow two contradicting things in the same small plot of soil at once. It is not the sentence that fails on these nights. It is the checking that quietly unplants it before it ever has a chance to root. Think for a moment of a young man who sends a message to someone he hopes will call him back about work. He sets the phone down on the table, and within 30 seconds he has already picked it back up to see whether it has been read. He does this 11 times within the hour, and each time he checks, a fresh small wave of worry washes in, right over the hope he felt the moment he first pressed send. By the end of the day he is worn out, not because the answer never came, but because he spent every hour quietly unsending his own faith, one anxious glance at a time. This is precisely what happens when you speak your sentence before bed, and then lie awake half the night, turning it over in your mind to see whether it has taken hold yet. The checking itself interrupts the very thing being checked for. Faith cannot be spoken and doubted in the very same breath. One of the two has to be laid down. Think also of a woman who plants tomatoes in her small backyard. She waters them gently in the cool of the evening. She speaks kindly to them, the way some quiet gardeners do, and then she walks back into her house and leaves them alone. She does not dig them up before dawn to check on the roots, because some deep old wisdom in her already knows that digging disturbs the very thing she is trying to grow. And if she dug every single morning to inspect the progress, she would spend her whole summer holding torn roots in her hands, instead of tomatoes. Your sentence deserves that same simple trust. Speak it once, and then walk away from it, the way you would walk away from soil you have already tended well. It is not the watering that harms the tomatoes. It is the constant digging that keeps them from ever settling into the ground long enough to grow. Picture too a fisherman who casts his net into the water at dusk and then goes home to rest. He does not stand at the shoreline all night, pulling the net up every few minutes to see what has gathered in it, because he knows that constant pulling only frightens away whatever might be quietly moving toward it in the dark. Your sentence is very much like that net cast gently into the deep waters of your own subconscious. Cast it once, with feeling, and then walk home to your rest. Let the deep waters do what deep waters have always known how to do, long before you ever came along worrying over them. It is not the casting that requires your effort. It is the walking away afterward that requires your trust. And consider one more small everyday picture. A woman waiting for an important letter checks her mailbox not once but 4 or 5 times in a single afternoon, walking out to the same empty box again and again, as though her checking might somehow hurry the mail carrier along. Of course it never does. The letter arrives whenever it arrives, entirely unmoved by how many times she opened that little metal door, and yet she wears herself thin with the walking back and forth. Your faith often works this same way. The answer is already moving toward you on its own schedule, and no amount of checking your feelings, your bank balance, or your mood in the middle of the night will make it arrive one moment sooner. It will only make the waiting heavier than it ever needed to be. Consider also a farmer standing at his window at dawn, scanning the sky for rain he has already prayed for. If he stands there every hour of the day, arms crossed, scowling at clear blue sky, he only exhausts himself, waiting for something that was never going to be hurried along by his scowling. But the farmer who has learned this key plants his faith the way he plants his seed, once, thoroughly, and then goes about tending the rest of his farm, trusting the same sky that has never once in the whole history of the earth forgotten to eventually send rain. His peace does not depend on the clock, and neither should yours. Florence Scovel Shinn called this letting go and letting God, and she meant it quite literally. The letting go is not passive laziness. It is an active, deliberate act of trust, in some ways harder than gripping ever was, because gripping at least feels like doing something, even when it accomplishes nothing at all, while releasing feels like risk, even though it is the only thing that has ever actually worked. Picture yourself tonight, speaking your sentence softly into the dark. My supply flows to me now. My word is my wand. And then picture yourself turning over, closing your eyes, and simply trusting the words to do their quiet work, exactly the way a seed does its quiet work underground, where no one is watching. It is not the strength of your grip that carries the word forward. It is the willingness of your hand to finally open. Pause for a moment now and think of the one thing you have been checking on the most this week. Perhaps the account balance you refresh 3 or 4 times a day. Perhaps a message thread you reread long after it has already been answered. Perhaps a mirror you search for evidence in before you even feel ready to look. Simply notice how much of your week has quietly been spent gripping instead of resting, and let that very thing be the first thing you finally release tonight. Not with force, not with a dramatic vow never to check again, but simply by speaking your sentence once and letting your hand stay open the rest of the night. You will not see the roots forming tonight. You may not even see them forming this week, but underground, unseen, something is always moving steadily toward the light the moment faith finally stops digging it up to check. It is not the checking that grows your supply. It is the trusting that quietly lets it grow undisturbed. Tonight I speak my word once, and I release it fully into the keeping of infinite supply. The 7th key is the deepest one, and it will take a little longer to walk through tonight, because it is really several turns of the very same key. So let us walk through it slowly, one turn at a time, and let each turn settle fully before we move on to the next. This is the key that quietly holds all the others together, and if you only remember one teaching from this whole evening, let it be this one. First, consider this. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that your outer supply, the money in your account, the opportunities that arrive or fail to arrive, the doors that open or stay shut, is never the true source of your abundance at all. It is only ever the shadow cast by something deeper, your self-concept, the quiet, unspoken belief you privately carry about who you are and what you are entitled to receive. This is why two people can face the exact same financial circumstance, the same overdue bill, the same uncertain month, and one grows more anxious while the other grows strangely calm. The circumstance did not decide their peace. Their self-concept did. So the very first turn of this key asks you a simple and searching question. When you say your bedtime sentence, who do you secretly believe is saying it? A person who has always struggled, quietly hoping the sentence might finally work this time, or a person who has simply always been supplied, calmly stating a fact that was true long before tonight? The words can be identical, and yet the results will be entirely different, because the subconscious does not obey your words nearly as much as it obeys the self-concept underneath the words. It is not the sentence that fails on the hard nights. It is the frightened self quietly whispering underneath the sentence that fails it. Second, consider this. Picture a woman named Elena who works long night shifts and has spoken her bedtime sentence faithfully for weeks. Every evening she says, "I am one with infinite supply," and every morning she wakes and checks her account with a small, tight breath held in her chest, waiting to be disappointed. Week after week, the sentence sounds the same, but underneath it, nothing has actually moved. Because Elena is still secretly the same anxious tenant she has always been, simply reciting new words in the old, trembling voice. This is the exact trap Florence Scovel Shinn warned against, speaking beautiful words while still quietly living inside a frightened identity. It is a little like painting a fresh coat of gold paint over a door that is still bolted shut from the inside. The door looks different, but it has not actually opened, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, because so many of us have done exactly what Elena did. We have collected lovely sentences the way some people collect keys they never quite try in the lock, hoping the sentence alone will do the work that only a changed self can do. Third, consider what changes everything for someone like Elena. One evening, instead of simply repeating the sentence, she pauses and asks herself honestly, "Who is the woman lying here saying these words?" And she notices, gently, without shame, that it is still the frightened girl who grew up hearing there was never quite enough, who watched her own mother count coins at a kitchen table late at night, who learned very early that money was something you feared before you ever learned it was something you could trust. And in that quiet noticing, something remarkable becomes possible. Because once you can see the old anxious self clearly, you are no longer fully inside it. You have stepped back, just far enough to release it. And here it must be said plainly and gently. This releasing is not a loss of any kind. It is not a death of the person. It is only the quiet dissolving of a false and frightened identity that was never truly you to begin with, so that the real self, the one who has never actually been separate from infinite supply, the one who has been waiting patiently underneath the fear the entire time, is finally set free to come forward. This is the tenderest turn of the whole key, because it asks you to be honest about who has been speaking your sentence, and honest enough to let that anxious voice finally rest. Pause for a moment now, and ask yourself the very same question Elena asked. When you speak your own sentence tonight, who is speaking it? Be gentle with whatever answer arrives, because simply seeing it clearly is already the beginning of its release. Fourth, consider how differently a statement sounds once it is spoken by someone who has made this release. Florence Scovel Shinn often pointed out that most people speak affirmations the way a nervous student recites an answer he is not fully sure of, quickly, a little breathlessly, glancing sideways to see if it landed correctly. But a person who has quietly reclaimed their true identity does not recite, they simply state. There is no pleading in a statement. There is only calm ownership. Imagine a young man walking into a room to be considered for a promotion he deeply wants. If he introduces himself with his shoulders curled inward, apologizing before anyone has even asked him a question, the room feels his self-concept before he says a single word about his qualifications. But if that same young man walks in already knowing quietly who he is, without arrogance and without apology, simply steady, the room feels that too, and often responds to it before he has proven anything at all. Your sentence at night works the very same way. The words matter, but the person speaking them matters far more. Think of it this way. A check signed by someone whose name means nothing to the bank will bounce no matter how large the number written on it. But a check signed by someone whose name the bank already trusts completely will clear without a single question asked. Your sentence is the number written on the check. Your self-concept is the signature, and it is the signature, far more than the number, that decides whether the whole thing clears. Fifth, consider this. Once the old identity has been gently laid aside, the sentence you speak stops being a wish, thrown hopefully into the dark, and becomes something closer to a decree. A decree is not a request. It is an announcement made by someone who already understands their own quiet authority. When a person who owns their home decides to repaint a room, they do not ask the walls for permission. They simply begin. Your relationship to supply is meant to feel exactly that ordinary and that authoritative. So when you say, "Tonight, I am one with infinite supply, and my word is my wand," you are not launching a request up into some distant sky and hoping it lands correctly. You are quietly reclaiming a truth that was never actually lost, only forgotten under years of borrowed fear. And Elena, months into this practice, finally noticed the difference the night she said her sentence and felt nothing tremble underneath it at all. Just a plain, settled knowing, the way you know your own name without ever needing to check it. She told a friend later that the strangest part was how unremarkable it felt. No fireworks, no sudden rush of emotion, only a quiet steadiness that had somehow always been there underneath the fear, waiting to be noticed. Sixth, consider this. The reason this key must be walked so slowly is that self-concept rarely shifts through one dramatic moment. It shifts the way tide shifts a shoreline. Patiently, repeatedly, one gentle wave at a time, reshaping what the sand quietly believes about itself. Some nights your sentence will feel like nothing more than words, and that is perfectly fine. You are not required to feel transformed every single evening. You are only required to keep speaking as the self who is already whole, already provided for, already resting safely inside a supply that has never once run dry in the entire history of the universe. Think of a riverbank slowly being reshaped by water that never once shouts or forces its way through. It simply keeps moving, patiently, night after night, and the stone that once seemed permanent is eventually smooth, eventually shaped entirely differently than it began. Your fear is that stone, and your sentence, spoken quietly and faithfully, even on the nights it feels like nothing, is that patient water. It does not need your belief to be complete on the first night. It only needs your willingness to keep speaking on the nights when belief still feels far away. And slowly, wave after wave, night after night, that old, anxious shoreline reshapes itself into something calmer, something more solid, something that no longer flinches at the sound of an unexpected bill or an uncertain month. Seventh, consider this. The true evidence that this key has turned is not a sudden windfall, though those do come. The true evidence is a quiet morning, ordinary in every way, where you simply forget to be afraid. Elena said it herself, months later, that she could no longer remember the exact night the fear had quietly left her voice. Only that one evening, she noticed her sentence sounded less like a hope and more like a fact, and that she had stopped checking her account with that small, tight breath held in her chest, without even deciding to stop. It had simply fallen away. The way a habit falls away, once the fear underneath it has finally been laid to rest. Eighth, consider one more thing, worth carrying with you long after tonight. This release of the old anxious self is not a single event you complete once and then never revisit. It is a practice you will return to again and again. The way you return to washing your hands or locking your door, because old fear has a way of quietly slipping back in through the same worn path it always used. A difficult phone call, a birthday that reminds you how far behind you feel, a stranger's careless comment about money. Any of these can momentarily call the frightened self back to the surface, and this is not failure, and it is not proof that the work has not held. It is simply an invitation to release it again, gently, the same way you did the first time. Florence Scovel Shinn never taught that consciousness is built once and then finished forever. She taught that it is tended, the way a garden is tended, season after season, and the tending itself, returned to faithfully, is what eventually makes the garden something you can trust without thinking about it at all. This is the deepest secret hiding inside the words you speak before bed. It was never really about the money at all. The money was only ever the visible shoreline. The real work, the real miracle, was always happening underneath, in the quiet reshaping of who you believe yourself to be. It is not the sentence that changes your supply. It is the self who finally believes the sentence that changes everything else around it. And so tonight, before you speak your own words, take one slow breath and let yourself release, quietly and without struggle, whatever frightened self has been whispering underneath your sentence up until now, and let the true self, the one who was never actually poor, never actually behind, never actually forgotten, finally step forward and speak in your place. I release the old frightened self tonight, and I let the true self, always supplied, finally speak in my place. The eighth key is that once your self-concept begins to steady, supply will not always arrive wearing the costume you expected, and Florence Scovel Shinn was very clear about this. She taught that supply moves in ways so varied and so quietly clever that a mind fixed on only one channel will miss half its own miracles simply by staring too hard at the one door it expects them to walk through. So many people speak their bedtime sentence faithfully and then spend the next day watching only their mailbox, or only their bank notification, or only the one job they applied for. And when nothing appears there, they quietly conclude the sentence failed, when in truth, supply may have arrived that very day through an unexpected refund, a forgotten debt repaid, a stranger's small kindness, a sudden idea worth far more than money, an old friend calling with exactly the right connection at exactly the right hour. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that your only real job is to keep your consciousness supplied, and to let the universe choose the channel, because the universe has far more channels available to it than your anxious imagination has ever considered. Let me walk you through a week that happens to almost everyone. A woman applies for a promotion she has wanted for 2 years. She speaks her sentence faithfully every single night. My supply is secure. My word is my wand. And every single morning she checks her email first thing, hoping to see the one message she has decided must be the answer. Monday, nothing. Tuesday, nothing. By Wednesday, she is quietly convinced her words have failed her. And yet that very Wednesday afternoon, her car insurance company calls to say she was overcharged for 2 years and owes a refund. She almost brushes right past it, because in her mind that was not the miracle she was watching for. Thursday, a neighbor she barely speaks to knocks on her door simply to return a dish, and mentions, almost in passing, that her own company is hiring for a role that fits perfectly. By Friday, the promotion still has not come, and she feels the old disappointment rising, until she pauses and finally sees the whole week laid out plainly: the refund, the neighbor, the sudden opening, 3 separate quiet miracles she nearly missed because she had already decided ahead of time exactly which door Supply was allowed to walk through. This is precisely what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she said the ways of Supply are past finding out, not because Supply is hiding from you, but because it is far too abundant and far too creative to be confined to the single narrow channel your fear insists it must use. It is not the size of the door you are watching that decides your miracle. It is the number of doors you are willing to leave unguarded by fear. Think of a house with 9 windows, and a man who insists on standing at only one of them all day long, arms folded, waiting for the mail carrier, while sunlight and fresh air and the sound of children playing pour freely through the other 8 windows he never once turns to notice. He is not wrong that light is coming into his house. He is only wrong about which window he has decided is the only one worth trusting. Supply behaves exactly this way. It is already filling the whole house. And your only real task is to stop guarding one window so tightly that you forget to feel the warmth already moving through the rest of the room. Picture also a man who prays sincerely for a large check and grows quietly irritated every time a small, unexpected $20 finds its way to him instead, because in his mind, that small amount barely counts. And in his irritation, he actually pushes the very evidence of his own answered word further away. A person who has learned this key receives that same small 20 with real and open delight and says quietly, "Thank you. Supply is moving toward me even now." And in saying it that way, keeps the whole channel wide open rather than narrowing it back down to the one shape his fear had already decided it must take. Gratitude, spoken sincerely over even the smallest sign of movement, becomes a doorway, not because the universe needs to be thanked in order to keep working, but because gratitude keeps your own consciousness soft and receptive, instead of clenched shut around a disappointment that was never really disappointment at all, only supply arriving in a shape you had not yet learned to recognize. Consider also an older man who spent decades believing that supply could only ever arrive through his paycheck, and so every weekend away from work felt to him like a small famine, a stretch of days when nothing could possibly come, until one quiet Saturday, a distant cousin he had not spoken with in years mailed him a small inheritance from an aunt he barely remembered. Arriving on a day he had long ago decided was closed for business as far as supply was concerned, he sat at his kitchen table holding that envelope and laughed softly at himself, not bitterly, but with the gentle laughter of someone finally seeing how small his own expectations had been compared to how wide supply had actually been working all along. Pause for a moment now and think back over your own last 7 days. Quietly count anything small that came to you without struggle: a kind word, an unexpected discount, a bill that turned out lower than feared, a ride offered before you had to ask. Most people let these pass by unlabeled, filed away as ordinary luck rather than named for what they actually are. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that whatever goes unnamed tends to go unnoticed the next time it arrives too. So name it. Quietly, out loud if you can. That was supply. And watch how much more of it you begin to see, simply because you finally gave it a name worth recognizing. This is also why disappointment so often arrives disguised as delay, the promotion that has not come yet, the answer that has not arrived yet. These can feel like proof that your word failed, when they are very often only proof that supply chose a longer, wiser road toward the very same door, a road that quietly gathers the neighbor, the refund, the unexpected call, before it finally delivers the thing you originally asked for. It is not delay that means your word failed. It is delay quietly assembling a better arrival than the one you were impatiently watching for. Tonight, as you speak your sentence, you may add one small line if you feel called to, and I receive it however it chooses to come. Let that single line quietly widen every door in your life, instead of narrowing your miracle down to the one shape your fear insists it must be. It is not the size of the channel that matters. It is the openness of the hand waiting beneath it. I receive my supply gladly, in whatever form it chooses to arrive. The ninth key is simply this, that this sentence you speak before bed is meant to become as ordinary and as unremarkable to you as breathing, not a desperate ritual performed only on hard nights when fear has grown loud, but a quiet, steady habit performed even on the easy nights, even on the nights when supply already feels abundant, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that consciousness is not built during the crisis, it is only revealed there. Whatever you have quietly practiced on the calm, ordinary evenings is exactly what will rise up and hold you steady the moment an uncertain evening finally arrives. Picture a man who only remembers his sentence on the night before rent is due. He lies there anxious, whispering it quickly, hoping it will do in one desperate breath what it was always meant to do, across 100 quiet ones. And because he has never practiced it on the calm nights, the words feel thin in his mouth, exactly when he needs them to feel solid. Now picture a second man, no more gifted, no more secure, who has simply said his sentence every single night for a year, on nights when the bank balance was healthy and on nights when it was not, on nights when nothing at all was wrong and there was no reason to say it except that saying it had become his quiet habit. When a hard month finally comes to him too, because it comes to every life eventually, he does not have to search for faith in the dark. Faith is already sitting there waiting, worn smooth and familiar from 100 ordinary evenings before it. This is the whole difference between a sentence spoken in panic and a sentence spoken as a way of life. It is not the crisis that teaches you to trust supply. It is the plain, unremarkable nights that came quietly before it. Think also of how a well-worn path through a field is never made by one single dramatic walk. It is made by the same quiet footsteps returning again and again until the ground itself remembers the way. Your sentence, spoken faithfully across the plain, unremarkable nights, wears exactly this kind of path through your own consciousness, so that when a harder season eventually comes, you are not asked to invent faith from nothing in the middle of a storm. You are only asked to walk the same familiar path your own feet have already worn smooth, long before the storm ever arrived. So tonight, whether your day was hard or easy, whether your accounts feel full or thin, speak your sentence exactly the same, not louder because you are afraid, not softer because you feel safe. Simply steady, simply yours. Think of the many nights ahead of you that will hold nothing dramatic at all. An ordinary dinner, an ordinary walk home, an ordinary lying down at the end of an ordinary day. Those are not the throwaway nights. Those are the nights where your whole future consciousness is quietly being built, one warm golden brick at a time, so that when the harder night eventually comes, you will not be starting from nothing. You will be reaching for a sentence your own mind already knows by heart, already trusts, already leans on the way you lean on a familiar hand in the dark. And years from tonight, when you look back over this whole season of your life, you may find you can no longer even point to the exact evening things began to change, only that somewhere along the quiet, unremarkable nights, everything simply became lighter. This is the quiet ending of everything we have walked through together tonight. One small sentence, spoken sincerely, spoken as someone who already knows who they are, released without gripping, practiced not only in crisis but in peace, is enough, over time, to gently reshape an entire life. I speak my one true sentence tonight, and I let it quietly become the whole shape of my life. Here is the whole picture. It is not the sentence alone that carries the miracle. It is the self who finally believes the sentence. It is not effort that grows your supply while you sleep. It is the single seed you were faithful enough to plant only once. It is not the crisis that builds your consciousness. It is the quiet, ordinary nights that came long before it. It is not gripping that protects your good. It is releasing that finally lets it land. Each key we walked through tonight was never really 9 separate teachings. It was one single key, turning again and again in the same quiet lock, the lock of who you have secretly believed yourself to be. And every time you speak your sentence tonight, as someone already whole, already held, already supplied, that lock turns a little further open. If tonight's teaching has settled something in you, and you find yourself wanting to walk this path with real steady company rather than alone, the Overflow Covenant was built exactly for that. It is a small, warm circle gathered around these very Florence Scovel Shinn principles, gentle weekly guidance, real practices you can carry into ordinary evenings, just like the ones we walked through together tonight, and a community quietly holding the same faith you are learning to hold. It is $33 to begin, fully covered by a 30-day guarantee, so there is truly nothing to risk in trying it. You will find the link waiting for you in the description below whenever you feel ready. Say your sentence with me one final time tonight. I am one with infinite supply, and infinite supply flows to me now. My word is my wand. And as you finally close your eyes tonight, remember that the whole miracle was always this simple, one honest sentence, spoken before bed, believed by a self who has finally remembered who they are. Chosen one, wealth is coming. Florence Shinn explained the sign you're seeing. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the signs you keep noticing in your outer world are never accidents. They are the universe answering a call you already made in consciousness long before your eyes ever caught the evidence. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, verse 24, it is written, "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear." And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The answer is already moving, before the request is even finished being spoken," which means the number you keep seeing, the sudden idea, the kind stranger, the door that keeps opening in your imagination is not luck dropped in your lap. It is supply already in motion, already answering, already on its way to you. And here is where most people miss it completely. They believe the sign itself is the treasure, so they chase it, they watch for it, they wait for it to repeat one more time before they will finally believe. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a sign is only ever a whisper from your own consciousness, confirming what you have already accepted as true. So the very way most people try to receive their wealth, by watching and waiting and hoping the sign shows up again, is the very habit that keeps them standing outside a door that has been open the entire time. So before we open the keys, let us plant a new word in your mouth right now. A 3-part decree that turns you from a watcher of signs into a doer of the word. Say it with me. I am the chosen vessel for my own good. Wealth is already coming to meet me. My word is my wand. Again, I am the chosen vessel for my own good. Wealth is already coming to meet me. My word is my wand. If something in you just went quiet when you spoke that, if you felt a door move somewhere inside your chest, type the 2 words, God supplies, in the comments right now. Let it be your seal, and let us begin. The first key is this. The sign is not the miracle. The sign is the receipt. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the outer world is only ever a screen upon which the inner world is projected. So when you keep seeing the same number on the clock, the same phrase in 3 separate conversations, the same bird landing near your window 3 mornings in a row, it is not the universe teasing you with a hint of something that might come later. It is consciousness handing you a receipt for a payment already made in the unseen. Think of a woman who orders a package online. She does not stand at the mailbox waiting for the confirmation email to decide whether she actually ordered it. The email simply confirms what she already set into motion with her own decision and her own payment. She placed the order in private, quietly, before anyone else knew, and only afterward does the outer world begin sending its little updates, its little tracking numbers, its little proofs that the thing is already moving toward her door. And this is exactly how supply works. You plant the acceptance first in feeling and in word, and only then does the outer world begin sending you its little receipts, its little confirmations, its little winks. Now picture that same woman if she had never actually placed the order and yet stood at the mailbox every day anyway, hoping an email might arrive out of nowhere, hoping a package might show up that she never truly claimed. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is precisely what so many people do with their own good. They wait at the mailbox of life, watching for a sign without ever having quietly placed the order within their own consciousness first, and then when nothing arrives, they call it bad luck, when really there was simply no claim made for the mail to confirm. So when you see the sign again this week, do not ask, "What does this mean is coming?" Ask instead, "What did I already accept that is now confirming itself?" Because it is not the sign that brings the wealth. It is the accepted state behind the sign that brings the wealth. The sign is only ever the mailman, never the gift. And once you stop worshipping the mailman and start recognizing the gift you already signed for, the whole chase ends and the receiving begins. This week, when you notice your particular sign, whatever it is for you, pause right there on the sidewalk or in your kitchen and quietly say, "I see the receipt, the payment is already made," and let that be enough. Let that be complete in itself. Do not run to tell 5 people. Do not need it to repeat twice more before you believe it. Simply receive the receipt the way you would receive any confirmation you already expected. With a calm, quiet, settled nod, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a grateful, settled recognition of the sign does more for your supply than any amount of anxious watching for the next one ever could. And once this quiet trust becomes your habit, you are no longer a person hunting for signs. You are simply a person who ordered well and is now, calmly, watching the delivery arrive. I see the receipt, and I bless the payment already made. The second key is this: the world you see is only ever mirroring the self you have agreed to be. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught over and over that no situation can correct itself until self is corrected, meaning the sign you see is never really about the outer event at all. It is a mirror held up to your own self-concept, showing you plainly what you currently believe yourself worthy to receive. Consider a man who has quietly decided, somewhere beneath his own awareness, that he is the kind of person who almost makes it, but never quite arrives. Watch his life. The raise gets delayed by 1 cycle. The check arrives but is slightly smaller than expected. The deal falls through by a hair at the final signature, and he calls this bad luck. He calls this timing. He calls this the economy. But Florence Scovel Shinn would gently take him by the shoulders and say, "No, this is not luck. This is your self-concept, faithfully, precisely, lovingly mirrored back to you by a universe that cannot argue with your own word about yourself." Now walk into a second kitchen, a second ordinary evening, and meet a woman who is about to ask her manager for a raise. She has more than earned. She has rehearsed the number in the shower. She has rehearsed it in the car. And yet the moment she sits down across the desk, her voice goes small. She lowers the number before anyone has even challenged her. She adds the word maybe. She adds the word if that is even possible. And the manager, hearing a request already shrinking itself, offers exactly half of what was asked. And she walks out telling herself the timing was simply not right this quarter. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the timing was never the true obstacle in that room. The mirror was. She carried in a self-concept that had already agreed, long before that meeting, that she was someone who asks small and receives smaller, and the outer negotiation had no real power to overrule what had already been decided within. The manager was not being cruel. The manager was simply the glass, reflecting back the exact shape she had already handed it. Here is the mercy hidden inside this teaching. If the outer world is only a mirror, then you were never actually fighting circumstances at all. You were only ever having a conversation with a reflection, and no one wins an argument with their own reflection by yelling at the glass. You win it by changing the face. Think of it the way you might think of an actual mirror hanging on your own wall at home. If your hair is out of place, and you glare at the mirror and demand that it show you something neater, the mirror will not obey the demand. It can only ever obey the face. So you reach up, you fix the hair yourself, and only then does the reflection change. And it changes instantly, without argument, without delay, because that is simply what mirrors do. They do not resist, they do not negotiate, they only ever repeat exactly what is placed in front of them. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that your outer finances behave with that exact same quiet obedience. So this week, notice the pattern that keeps repeating in your own finances, the same shortfall, the same delay, the same near miss. And instead of blaming the mirror, ask what quiet belief about myself is standing in front of the glass, creating this exact shape. Is it a belief that says, I always just miss it? Is it a belief that says, money is hard for people like me? Is it a belief inherited from a parent who said it first, sitting at their own kitchen table with their own tight voice? Whatever it is, pause for a moment right now and name it honestly, just to yourself. Because a belief that has finally been spoken plainly is a belief that has already begun losing its grip. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the moment you consciously deny the old belief and consciously claim the new one, the mirror has no choice but to change its picture, because a mirror does not negotiate. A mirror only ever reflects, so speak the new belief plainly today. Say, I am the kind of person wealth flows toward easily. Say it while you fix your hair in your own mirror if it helps you feel the parallel. And keep saying it until the face you are showing the glass has actually changed. Because once the face changes, the reflection has no power left to stay the same. And that is why the third key matters so much, because it will show you exactly where that face gets built in the first place. I am the face behind the mirror, and I choose the face that wealth flows toward. The third key is this. Before any harvest shows itself above the ground, the whole story is decided beneath it. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the spoken word is a seed, and consciousness is the soil, and no farmer stands over freshly planted ground shouting at it to hurry. The farmer waters, the farmer tends, the farmer trusts the process, even while the soil looks completely empty on the surface. But so many people treat their own words the opposite way. They speak a hopeful word once, glance at their bank account 5 minutes later, see no change, and immediately plant a fresh seed of doubt right on top of the first one. So nothing has time to root, nothing has time to grow. The ground stays turned over and disturbed forever. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is precisely why so many prayers seem to go unanswered, not because supply is slow, but because the one praying keeps digging the seed back up to check on it. Consider a woman who applies for a position she truly wants. She speaks her claim the night before. Something simple. This position is already mine in divine right. And she means it fully when she says it. But the very next morning she checks her email, before she has even poured her coffee. Nothing yet. She checks again at 9. Nothing yet. By 11 she has checked 4 more times, and each check carries a small, silent question underneath it. Did it work? Did it really work? And by that evening, she has quietly buried her own seed under 4 or 5 fresh handfuls of doubt, without ever noticing she did it. Florence Scovel Shinn would say she never actually stopped believing on purpose. She simply forgot that a claim spoken once in faith does not need to be rechecked to remain true. A seed does not grow faster because the gardener keeps lifting it out of the soil to inspect the roots. It grows slower, or it does not grow at all, because it is never left undisturbed long enough to take hold. Think also of water set to boil on a stove. Lift the lid every few minutes to check on it, and you only ever let the heat escape. Leave the lid resting quietly in place, and the same water reaches its boil in its own good time. Consciousness behaves the very same way. The anxious lifting of the lid, the anxious digging at the soil, the anxious refreshing of the inbox. These do not speed anything along. They only release the very warmth that was doing the work. So this week, practice this exercise. Pick one single financial desire, something real, a bill you want cleared, an opportunity you want opened, and speak your claim over it once, fully, with feeling, and then let it rest. Do not check on it every hour with anxious eyes. Do not retell your worried friends the whole story again and again. Treat it the way a farmer treats a planted field. Water it once a day with a calm, repeated word, and otherwise leave the soil alone to do what soil has always known how to do. And if the old habit of checking rises up in you, as it will, do not scold yourself for it. Simply notice it gently and return to the one settled word. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a single seed planted once in genuine faith carries more life in it than 100 seeds scattered nervously across the same small patch of ground in a single afternoon. The soil was never the problem, the disturbance was the problem, and consciousness, once truly convinced, becomes the fertile ground. And a fertile ground planted once in faith will always outperform a doubtful ground planted 10 times before evening. I plant my word once, and I let the unseen do what it already knows how to do. The fourth key is this: wealth is not something you go out and find. Wealth is something you become, and then it finds you. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that no amount of outer effort will ever outrun an inner identity that has not yet agreed to be wealthy. This is the deepest key so far. So let us unfold it slowly, in pieces, the way a letter is unfolded when you want to read every line. First, consider that most people were handed their financial identity before they were even old enough to question it. A household where money was spoken of only in tight voices at the kitchen table. A parent who sighed every time a bill arrived. A childhood where the phrase, "we cannot afford," that was said so often it became furniture in the mind. Sit with that image for a moment. A child sitting at the dinner table, hearing that sentence land again and again. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times across years of ordinary evenings. Until the sentence is no longer even heard as a sentence at all, it becomes simply the temperature of the room, the way the walls feel, the way money itself feels. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that whatever is absorbed without argument in those early years becomes the silent architecture of the adult self-concept. So a grown woman today can be earning a perfectly respectable income and still feel a tight, familiar panic every time she opens her banking app, not because the number is actually bad, but because the old identity installed in childhood is still sitting quietly at the control panel, whispering the same old sentence it has whispered for 30 years. We cannot afford that, and no amount of raises will fully satisfy an identity that was never given permission to feel safe with money in the first place. The raise arrives, and the panic simply finds a new object to attach itself to, because the identity underneath was never actually addressed. Second, consider the ordinary shape of a single day lived inside a poverty identity versus a day lived inside a wealth identity, because this is where the teaching stops being abstract and becomes something you can actually catch yourself doing. Picture the poverty identity waking at 7, and before the feet even touch the floor, the mind is already doing math, already subtracting, already bracing. By 8, it is standing in the coffee line, calculating whether the $4 is really necessary today. By 10, it is glancing at an email from a coworker announcing a promotion and feeling something small and sour tighten in the chest. By noon, it is watching a colleague unwrap a new bag and feeling a private ache it will not admit to anyone. By 2, it is putting something back on the grocery shelf, not because it truly cannot be afforded, but because some old inherited voice says people like us do not buy things like that. By 3, it is opening an email from the bank with a held breath and a clenched jaw. By 5, it is driving home rehearsing an argument about a bill that has not even happened yet. By 7, it is scrolling past a beautiful home online and closing the tab quickly, telling itself that is not for people like me. By 10, it is lying in bed running the same worried numbers one more time before sleep. Now picture the wealth identity moving through that same exact day. Waking at 7 and stretching, not because the bank account is necessarily larger yet, but because the identity itself has settled. By 8, it orders the coffee without the silent math, not from recklessness but from quiet trust. By 10, it sees the co-worker's promotion and feels a real, unforced gladness, because abundance witnessed anywhere is proof abundance is real everywhere. By noon, it sees the colleague's new bag and simply enjoys it as beauty in the room. By 2, it picks up the very same item on the grocery shelf and places it in the cart without a single flinch. By 3, it opens the bank email calmly, curious rather than afraid. By 5, it drives home thinking of nothing in particular. By 7, it looks at the beautiful home online and thinks, that is the kind of thing that is on its way to me. By 10, it drifts to sleep with a soft, wordless gratitude. Notice, Florence Scovel Shinn would say, that the outer bank balance in both versions of that day may be nearly identical. The entire difference, every single hour of it, was the identity wearing the day, not the day itself. Third, consider a second story. A man standing in a fine clothing store looking at a well-made suit. The poverty identity inside him does the arithmetic before the salesperson even approaches. It whispers, "This is not for someone like me." It moves his feet toward the exit before his hand has even touched the fabric, and he leaves, telling himself he simply did not need a new suit today. But Florence Scovel Shinn would ask him gently to look again. Was it truly the money, or was it an old identity that has never once felt entitled to walk confidently into a room built for people it secretly believes are above him? Now picture that same man, having done the quiet daily work of this key for a season, walking into that very same store, running his hand over the same fabric, and feeling nothing strange at all, simply a calm, unremarkable sense of belonging. The suit may or may not be purchased that day, but the identity standing inside the store has completely changed, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this quiet sense of belonging in a room is worth more than any single purchase, because it is the very thing that eventually makes every purchase, every opportunity, every door, feel simply natural rather than borrowed. Fourth, consider that this means the actual work in front of you this week is not to hustle harder at the outer level. Though right action always has its place, the deeper work is to catch the old identity mid-sentence, the moment it whispers we cannot afford that, or that is not for people like me, and to gently, firmly answer it with a new sentence, out loud if you can, silently if you must. Something as simple as that: identity is not mine anymore. I am someone wealth is drawn to. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the false self must be allowed to die in exactly this way. Quietly, kindly, without drama. It is not a death of the body or a death to be feared. It is the dissolving of an old, borrowed identity, so that the true, deserving self underneath it is finally set free to receive. And every single time you catch the old sentence and replace it with the new one, you are not performing a nice little mental trick. You are literally reassigning which identity gets to wear your day, which identity gets to answer the phone when opportunity calls, which identity gets to walk into the room when the deal is on the table. Fifth, consider that an identity does not only shape how you feel about money, it shapes what you are even capable of noticing. The wealth identity walks past the very same street the poverty identity has walked past for years, and suddenly sees the storefront for lease. the flyer for the workshop, the friend who happens to mention exactly the connection that was needed. None of it was hidden. All of it was always right there. But a closed identity simply does not have eyes for a door it has already decided is not meant for it. This is precisely why two people can live in the same city, walk the same streets, read the same newspapers, and one seems to keep colliding with lucky openings, while the other insists nothing ever comes her way. It is never that supply skipped her, it is that her identity had not yet agreed to look up. Sixth, consider the woman we opened with, the one whose stomach tightens at her banking app. Imagine her doing this exact exchange 40 times a day for 30 days. Catching the old sentence, replacing it, catching it again, replacing it again. At first it feels almost silly, almost too small to matter. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that consciousness is built exactly the way a callus is built, not in one dramatic moment, but in thousands of small, repeated contacts, and by the end of 30 days, that woman opens her banking app and notices, almost by surprise, that her stomach did not tighten this time. And that is not a coincidence. And that is not luck. That is a new identity finally strong enough to hold the room. And once that identity is in place, wealth is no longer something she is chasing. Wealth has simply become the natural outer expression of the person she has quietly, patiently become on the inside. Which is exactly what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she taught that, as within, so without, and as above, so below. I release the identity that was never truly mine, and I claim the one that wealth already recognizes. If this key is opening something in you, and you want the next teaching to actually reach you, subscribe now, so it finds you the moment it is ready. The fifth key is this. Faith is not a feeling you wait to arrive. Faith is an action you take before the feeling shows up. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that most people have this exact order turned backwards in their own minds. They wait to feel confident before they act confident. They wait to feel wealthy before they act wealthy. They wait to feel forgiven before they act forgiven. And they spend years standing at the edge of the water, waiting for courage to arrive before they will finally step in. But courage was never going to arrive first. Courage arrives the moment the foot actually moves. Consider a locksmith standing in front of an old, stubborn lock. He does not stand there for an hour hoping the lock will feel like opening today. He does not ask the lock how it feels about being turned. He simply places the key and turns it, firmly, plainly, with no emotional negotiation required, and the lock, having no opinion of its own, simply opens, because that is what a properly turned key causes to happen regardless of mood. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that your spoken word, and the small brave action that so often accompanies it, functions exactly like that key. It does not need your doubt's permission to work, it only needs to be turned. Now picture an ordinary woman with an invoice sitting unsent on her desk for 11 days. Every single morning, she opens her laptop, looks at the draft, feels a small tightening in her chest, and closes the laptop again, telling herself she will send it once she feels a little more sure of herself, once she feels a little braver, once the fear settles down first. But the fear never settles down first. Fear rarely ever settles down first. It only ever settles down after the action has already been taken. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is precisely where so many people quietly stall out for years, waiting at the edge of a decision for a feeling that was only ever going to be produced by the decision itself. On the 12th day, still trembling a little, still unsure, she sends the invoice anyway, and something curious happens. The moment her finger leaves the mouse, before the client has even replied, before a single dollar has moved anywhere, the tightness in her chest quietly begins to loosen, not because the outer circumstance has changed yet, but because she has finally turned the key, and the feeling of faith, which could never lead, has now finally been given permission to follow. So this week, Do not wait for fear to fully clear out of the room before you speak your word or take your step. Make the call while your hands are still a little unsteady. Send the message while your stomach is still a little tight. Open the account you keep avoiding while your breath is still shallow. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that right action taken in faith is itself a spoken word, a decree made with the hands instead of the mouth, and the lock does not care whether your hand was trembling when it turned, it only cares that it turned. I turn the key today, and I let the feeling of faith follow the action of faith. The sixth key is this: supply is never actually the problem. The gate you have built against receiving it is the problem. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the river of substance is always flowing, always full, always available. The entire question is never whether the river has enough water. The entire question is whether you have left your gate open to receive it. So many people spend years praying for more water, while quietly, unconsciously, keeping their own gate shut with old fears about not deserving, old guilt about wanting more, old habits of giving their good away the moment it arrives out of some leftover feeling that they should not really keep it. It is not a shortage of supply that keeps most people thin in their finances. It is a narrowness in what they have trained themselves to hold. Consider a man who receives an unexpected bonus at work and within the same week finds 3 urgent reasons to spend every last dollar of it. The car needs something, a relative needs something, an old debt suddenly feels urgent again, and he calls this responsible, and sometimes it truly is. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that it is worth asking honestly whether some of that urgency was really necessity, or whether it was an old, hidden discomfort with holding wealth, a gate closing itself the moment the river actually arrived, because a person who has never made peace with receiving will always find a reason to let the water pass through their hands without pooling. Now picture a second version of that very same week. A woman receives an almost identical bonus, and the moment it lands in her account, an old familiar voice rises up inside her and says, "You should not really keep all of this. Someone else needs it more." So she calls her sister and offers half of it before she has even had a full day to simply sit with having it. She tells herself, this is generosity, and generosity is beautiful. Florence Scovel Shinn never once taught against giving, but she did teach that giving born of guilt is not the same as giving born of overflow. One closes the gate in the very act of appearing to open the hand. The other opens the gate even wider because it gives from a place that already feels full. So the honest question is never, am I generous enough? The honest question is, did I let the water pool in me first? Before I decided how it should move, think for a moment of an ordinary Tuesday. A small refund check arrives in the mail, completely unexpected. And watch how quickly the mind starts working. One part of you wants to feel simple, uncomplicated joy, and almost immediately, another part of you starts explaining the money away. It is not that much anyway. It will just go toward the electric bill. I should not get excited over something so small. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, notice that voice. That voice is the gate closing in real time. That small, quiet, almost polite refusal to simply enjoy having received something is the very habit that keeps the river thin in your experience, even while it remains full in truth. Now, follow that same Tuesday a little further, because the gate rarely closes just once. By the time the woman deposits that small refund check, she has already, without noticing, closed the gate 3 separate times before lunch. Once when she minimized the check itself, once when she felt a flicker of guilt for being glad about it, and once more when she quietly decided not to mention it to her husband because it felt silly to celebrate something so small. None of these moments feel dramatic. None of them feel like a decision at all. They feel like nothing. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is exactly how a gate stays shut for years without anyone ever noticing it is shut. Not through one loud refusal, but through 100 quiet little ones, each so small it never even asks to be examined. This happens in smaller ways too, and this is where the gate hides most successfully. Someone offers you a genuine compliment, and watch how fast the hand moves to deflect it. Oh, it was nothing. I got it on sale. It is really not that impressive. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that learning to receive gracefully is its own spiritual discipline, every bit as important as learning to give generously, because the way you receive a small compliment is quietly training the very same muscle that decides how you receive a large check. If the muscle is trained to deflect and minimize, it will deflect and minimize the compliment today and the raise next year. Using the exact same motion, without you ever noticing it, is the same gate closing both times. Picture that same muscle at work in a job interview. A hiring manager tells a candidate her portfolio is genuinely impressive, and instead of simply receiving the words, the candidate immediately explains that she got lucky with the timing, that anyone could have done it, that it was really a team effort. And Florence Scovel Shinn would gently point out that this candidate has just practiced closing her own gate in front of the very person who might have opened the largest door of her year, not because the manager withdrew the offer, but because a person who cannot receive a sentence of praise gracefully has not yet built the inner room large enough to comfortably receive an outer opportunity of that size. The gate and the room are the very same structure wearing two different names. So this week, practice letting a small amount of unexpected good simply stay with you without immediately explaining it away or giving it away out of guilt. If a compliment comes, receive it fully instead of deflecting it. Say only, "Thank you," and let the sentence end there. If a small windfall comes, let some portion of it simply rest in your account for a few days without anxious spending. Notice how that feels. Notice if there is a strange discomfort in letting good things stay, a restlessness, an urge to move the money quickly just to relieve the feeling. And if there is, that discomfort is the gate. Name it gently. Do not fight it. Simply say inwardly, "I am allowed to hold this," and let the sentence do its quiet work. And if you find the old habit returning, as it likely will more than once, do not treat that as proof the key failed. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a gate rusted shut by years of quiet refusal does not swing open easily on the very first try. It opens a little further each time you catch yourself and choose differently. The same way a hinge loosens with patient, repeated use rather than a single hard pull. So let each small practice this week, the received compliment, the check allowed to rest, the good news allowed to simply be good without qualification, be one more gentle turn of that same rusted hinge. It is not the size of the river that determines your wealth. It is the width you have trained your own gate to open. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the river was never lacking. It has been patient this whole time, waiting only for the gate of your own consciousness to finally open all the way, not by force, not by struggle, but by the simple, repeated practice of letting good things land in you and stay a moment before you decide what happens next. And once you understand that the gate was always yours to open, you are ready for the key that shows you exactly how the mouth becomes the hand that opens it. I open my own gate, and I let the river, that was always full, finally reach me. The seventh key is this, and it is the deepest one we will walk through together. So let us take it slowly, in careful pieces, the way you would carry something valuable across a room. First, consider that Florence Scovel Shinn taught the phrase that has become almost a signature of her whole teaching, that the word is a mold, and the substance which fills that mold is God, or if you prefer plainer language, is the great unformed supply of the universe itself, meaning every single time you speak, whether you notice it or not, you are pouring shape into that unformed substance. Most people speak all day long without ever realizing they are constantly casting molds. I am so broke, easy come, easy go, Money burns a hole in my pocket. I will never get ahead. These are not harmless little sayings. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that each one is a precise mold, cast in the exact shape of its own words, and the substance, being obedient and impartial, simply fills whatever shape it is given. It does not argue with you. It does not check whether you meant it. It fills the mold exactly as spoken, which means the wealthy-sounding sentence and the poverty-sounding sentence are equally powerful. The substance does not prefer one over the other. It only ever fills what it is given. Second, consider an ordinary week lived by two neighbors on the very same street, both facing a nearly identical unexpected expense. The first neighbor, hearing about the expense, says out loud, "Of course this happens to me. Nothing ever goes smoothly. I am always one step behind." And watch what happens next in her week. A second expense appears almost as if summoned. A small argument breaks out over the money. A friend cancels plans citing her own financial strain. And by Friday, the first neighbor is exhausted and says, "See, I told you, it is always something." And Florence Scovel Shinn would say gently, "Yes, you told the universe exactly what shape to build, and it built it, faithfully, obediently." The second neighbor, hearing about the very same kind of expense, pauses, breathes, and says out loud, "This is only a temporary ripple. Supply is unlimited, and it is already moving to cover this." And watch her week instead. A forgotten refund arrives in the mail. A client pays an invoice 2 weeks early. A friend insists on picking up the dinner bill without being asked. And by Friday she says, "See, it always works out." And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, "Yes, because you spoke the mold, and the same obedient substance filled that one too. The expense was nearly identical. The outer facts were nearly identical. The entire difference across that whole week was the mold each mouth chose to cast." Third, consider a small shopkeeper named Grace, who sells handmade candles from a little counter near her front window. For years she has answered every compliment on her candles with the same small sentence, "Oh, it is really just a hobby, nothing fancy." And she prices them low, apologetically low, because somewhere inside her the words, "nothing fancy," have already built the mold her income must fill. One afternoon, a customer offers to pay full price without blinking, and Grace hears herself say, "Oh, you do not have to pay that much. It is really not worth that." And the customer, confused, simply pays the lower price Grace insisted on. Florence Scovel Shinn would say that Grace did not lose that money to the customer. She lost it to her own mouth. The mold was cast the moment she called her own gift small, and no amount of skill in her hands could out-earn the smallness she kept speaking over her own work, until the day she catches herself mid-sentence and instead says, "This candle is crafted with real care, and it is worth every bit of its price." And slowly, candle by candle, week by week, her income begins rising to match the new shape she has finally dared to speak. Fourth, let us walk through one entire ordinary day and count the molds cast in it, the way you might count coins spilled across a table, because this is where the teaching stops sounding poetic and starts sounding uncomfortably familiar. A man wakes, and the very first thought crossing his mind is another day, another dollar, spoken lightly, almost as a joke, but a mold nonetheless. At breakfast, his child asks for a small treat, and he sighs, "We will see. Money does not grow on trees." Another mold. On the drive to work, he passes a beautiful home and mutters under his breath, "Must be nice. Some people have all the luck." Another mold. At his desk, a coworker mentions a bonus, and he says, "Must be nice for some. Wish that happened for the rest of us." Another mold. At lunch, he opens his wallet, counts what is left, and says quietly to himself, "This has to last me." Another mold. In the afternoon, a bill notification appears on his phone, and he says, "Of course, right on time." Another mold. By the time he drives home, he has spoken some version of lack or scarcity, perhaps a dozen times, without once raising his voice or seeming upset. It all felt so ordinary, so unremarkable, that he would be genuinely startled to be told he had spent the entire day quietly building a house out of exactly the materials he keeps saying he does not have enough of. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is precisely how the mold gets cast most often, not in one dramatic outburst, but in a dozen small, unnoticed murmurs strung together across an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. And this is precisely why the remedy cannot be a single dramatic prayer spoken once a week either. It must be a watchfulness carried gently through the ordinary hours, the very same hours where the old mold was quietly being built all along. Fifth, consider that this teaching demands total honesty about the small sentences you allow yourself to say when no one important seems to be listening. The tired little jokes about being broke, the automatic sigh when a bill arrives, the offhand comment to a coworker that you will never be able to afford a vacation like that, the quick text to a friend that simply says, "Ugh, I am so broke this month," sent so casually, it barely registers as a sentence at all. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the universe does not grade your speech on whether you were joking or whether you typed it instead of spoke it. It simply takes the mold as given and fills it. The written word is still a spoken word. The thumb typing on a screen is still a mouth casting a shape. So this week, pause for a moment and pick one real sentence you catch yourself saying or typing about money, almost on autopilot. Maybe it is, "I never have enough." Maybe it is, "Things like that never happen to me." Write it down honestly, look at it plainly, and then consciously build its replacement, something specific, something you can actually say with a straight face, such as "Supply flows to me from expected and unexpected directions," and practice saying the replacement in the exact moments the old sentence used to appear: when the bill arrives, when the coworker mentions the vacation, when the old joke tries to slip out at dinner or the thumb reaches for the phone. Catch it, replace it, every single time, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is not decoration, this is architecture. You are literally rebuilding the mold you have been unconsciously handing to the universe for years. Sixth, consider that even our prayers can quietly cast the wrong mold if we are not watching the words closely. A person kneels and says, "Please do not let this bill overwhelm me. Please do not let us lose the house." And the words "please do not let" are still, underneath their good intention, painting a picture of overwhelm and loss in vivid detail. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the substance fills the picture painted, not the fear behind it. So the very prayer meant to protect can accidentally reinforce the very thing it is trying to avoid. This does not mean your prayers were wrong or unloving. It simply means the wording can be lifted higher. Instead of "please do not let this bill overwhelm me," the higher word is "supply already covers this bill completely, and I am at peace." The feeling underneath both sentences may be the same tender wish for safety, but the mold cast is entirely different. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that it is always worth the small effort of choosing the higher wording, because the substance is listening far more literally than we usually remember. And this same lifting applies to the small prayers we barely notice we are praying. The muttered "please, just let this card go through at the register." The whispered, "Please do not let them notice the mistake." Each one can be lifted the very same way, from "please do not let" into "supply already covers this," from "please just let" into "this is already handled." Small shifts in wording, and yet Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the substance responds to the shape of the sentence far more than it responds to the intensity of the emotion behind it. Seventh, consider that there is a second layer to this same key that many people never reach, because it is not only your own words that shape your substance, it is also the words you allow to be spoken over you and about you, without correction. If someone says to you, "You will never get ahead with your history," and you simply nod and let it stand, Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a mold has just been cast over you by another mouth, and unless you consciously deny it and reclaim your own word, the substance may very well begin filling that borrowed shape too. This does not mean living in fear of every careless comment. It means developing the quiet habit of gently, internally, correcting anything spoken over you that does not match the wealth you are claiming. Someone can say the economy is terrible for people like us, and you do not need to argue with them out loud. But inwardly you say, "That is not my word. My word is that supply is unlimited for me regardless of headlines." And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this inward correction, practiced consistently, protects your mold from being shaped by every voice that happens to pass through your day. And this protection matters most inside the rooms you cannot simply leave. The family dinner where an uncle jokes that no one in this family ever gets ahead. The office break room where everyone agrees that raises never really come. The group chat where the running joke is always about being broke. You do not need to correct these rooms out loud. You only need to correct them quietly within yourself, every single time, so that the mold being cast in the air of that room never becomes the mold that settles into your own substance. Eighth, and this is where the key finally turns all the way. Consider that the reason this teaching is called the deepest one is because it asks you to take full, unshared responsibility for every mold you have ever cast, not to shame yourself over the years of accidental poverty speech. Florence Scovel Shinn never taught guilt, she taught correction, but to finally stop outsourcing the blame to luck, to timing, to other people, to the economy, and to stand plainly in front of your own mouth and say, "This has been the missing instrument the entire time, not my resume, not my circumstances, not my family history, my own spoken word." And once you stand there and truly own that, the most freeing feeling arrives right behind it, because if your mouth built the old mold, your mouth can build a new one starting today, this very hour, with the next sentence you choose to speak. And that is not a burden. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that it is the most hopeful news a person could ever receive, because it means you were never actually trapped by anything outside yourself at all. The shopkeeper was never trapped by the market. The anxious neighbor was never trapped by bad luck. The tired man was never trapped by his job. And you have never been trapped by your bank balance. You have only ever been shaping it, sentence by sentence, coin by unnoticed coin. And you may begin shaping it differently, starting with your very next word. Not tomorrow, not once the mood strikes, but with the very next sentence that leaves your mouth or your thumb after you finish hearing this. My word is the mold, and I fill it today with wealth, with ease, and with grace. The eighth key is this: patience is not passive waiting. Patience is active, faithful expectancy. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that there is a world of difference between a person who waits anxiously, checking constantly, and a person who waits expectantly, resting in the quiet certainty that the thing spoken is already arranged. And this difference, small as it sounds, is actually the whole hinge on which supply either flows freely or gets tangled in its own delivery. Consider the difference between a woman waiting for a delayed flight, who paces the gate every 3 minutes, sighing loudly, checking the board again and again, as though her anxious watching might somehow speed the plane, and a second woman at the very same gate, who has already claimed her seat in her mind, who orders a coffee, opens a book, and simply trusts the process she has no control over anyway. Both women board the exact same flight at the exact same time. The anxious watching changed nothing about the actual arrival. It only changed how peacefully or painfully the waiting was experienced. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is precisely how supply behaves too. Once the word has been spoken in faith, once the claim has been made, the anxious checking adds nothing to the timeline. It only adds suffering to the wait. Now widen that same picture into an ordinary week, because this key rarely shows itself in something as obvious as an airport. It shows itself in the small, repeated moments most people never even notice they are living inside of. Picture a man who has spoken his word over a job application on a Monday morning, calmly, plainly, fully believing it is already handled. By Tuesday afternoon, he finds himself checking his email 17 times before lunch. By Wednesday, he has quietly rehearsed 3 different disappointed reactions in his mind before any answer has even arrived. By Thursday, he is short with his family over something small and unrelated, because the tension of the unanswered waiting has been leaking out sideways into every corner of his day. And by Friday, when the answer finally comes, he receives it not with peace, but with relief, which is a very different feeling altogether. Relief is the sound of a held breath finally let go. Peace is the sound of a breath that was never actually held in the first place. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the second kind of waiting is the one that actually protects and strengthens the mold you have spoken, while the first kind quietly disturbs it, hour by hour, before it has even had the chance to fully set. So this week, notice where you are pacing the gate over something you have already spoken your word about: a job application, a payment you are expecting, an opportunity you have already claimed, and practice consciously sitting down at that gate instead. Order the metaphorical coffee. Open the metaphorical book. Remind yourself that the flight was never late because of your pacing, and it will never arrive early because of your pacing either. Your only real job once the word is spoken is to hold the state of already having received, while the outer mechanics quietly catch up to match it. And here is a simple, practical way to practice this. Whenever you catch yourself checking too soon, checking too often, reaching for the phone or the mailbox or the inbox, out of nervous habit rather than genuine reason, pause right there and say quietly to yourself, "It is already arranged," and then physically turn your attention to something else entirely. Water a plant, wash a dish, step outside for a moment. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that faith is proven far more by where you place your attention while you wait than by what you say in the one dramatic moment you first claimed your desire. A claim spoken once in faith and then buried under a week of anxious watching is like a seed planted carefully and then dug up every few hours to see if it has sprouted yet. Nothing given that kind of treatment ever gets the chance to root. Think also of the ordinary rhythm of the tide. It never rushes the shore out of impatience, and it never lingers past its appointed hour out of hesitation either. It simply moves on its own perfect, unhurried timing, entirely unconcerned with whether anyone standing on the beach believes it will arrive. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that supply moves in exactly this same unhurried, faithful rhythm. Once your word has truly set it into motion, your pacing does not delay the tide, and your peace does not delay it either. But your peace does make the waiting a place you can actually live inside of comfortably, rather than a place you are constantly trying to escape. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this settled expectancy is itself a form of faith so strong it does not need constant reassurance. And ironically, it is often the very people who have stopped anxiously checking who suddenly find their answer arriving, not because the anxious checking was somehow keeping the answer away out of spite, but because the peaceful state itself is a truer, cleaner mold, undisturbed by the static of fear. And a mold left undisturbed always sets more perfectly than one that keeps getting poked and reopened before it has had time to hold its shape. I rest in expectancy, and I let the unseen mechanics arrive on their own perfect time. The ninth key is this: you were never waiting to become the chosen one. You were only ever waiting to remember that you already are. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the very last step in this whole teaching is the quiet, almost startling recognition that the sign you kept seeing was never trying to convince you that something special was coming from outside. It was always trying to wake you up to something special that had been sitting inside you the entire time. Picture an ordinary kitchen table in an ordinary home, Nothing about the room looks remarkable. A chipped mug, a folded newspaper, the small hum of a refrigerator in the next room. And yet Florence Scovel Shinn taught that it is entirely possible for the person sitting at that plain table, cup of coffee in hand, morning light falling across an unremarkable chair, to carry within them a consciousness so settled, so wealthy, so certain of supply, that the whole room is quietly, invisibly crowned by their presence in it. Wealth was never a title handed out by circumstance. Wealth is a consciousness, carried into any room, no matter how plain that room appears. Consider a man named Walter, who spent 30 years believing the crown was reserved for someone else entirely, someone with a bigger house, a louder title, a longer resume. Every morning he sat at his own small table and quietly excused himself from his own good, telling himself that wealth belonged to a different kind of person than the one looking back at him in the toaster's dull reflection. He was not lazy, he was not careless. He simply never once considered that the very chair he sat in every single morning was already the seat of the chosen one. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say that this is the strange, gentle sadness underneath so many ordinary lives, not that the crown was ever taken away, but that it was never once put on, because no one had told him it had been resting there the whole time, waiting patiently for him to simply reach up and notice it. Now picture Walter one ordinary Tuesday, older now, having finally done the quiet inner work these 9 keys describe, sitting at that same table, in that same chair, with the same chipped mug in his hand, and nothing about the room has changed. The walls are the same walls, the light falls the same way it always has, and yet everything has changed, because the man sitting there has finally agreed to be who he already was. He no longer waits for a bigger house to feel entitled to ease. He no longer waits for a louder title to feel entitled to peace. He simply sits, crowned, in the plainest room he owns, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is the whole secret hiding in plain sight the entire time. The crown was never going to arrive with better furniture. It was only ever going to arrive with a truer thought. It is not a grander room that makes a person wealthy. It is a wealthier consciousness that makes any room enough. It is not a louder title that earns the crown. It is a quieter certainty that was wearing it all along. So this week, sit at your own ordinary table, in your own ordinary chair, and practice wearing the crown that was never actually missing. Not with arrogance, not with performance, but with the same simple, settled certainty of someone who has finally stopped auditioning for a role they were cast in long ago. Let the sign you have been seeing this whole time finally rest. Let it have done its work. Its work was only ever to point you back to yourself. And now that you have arrived there, wealth is no longer something coming toward a chosen one, somewhere out ahead of you. Wealth is something rising up quietly from the chosen one, who has been sitting right here the whole time. I wear the crown that was never missing, and I let wealth rise from right where I already am. Here is the whole picture. It is not the sign that saves you. It is the receipt behind the sign that you finally learn to trust. It is not the outer world correcting itself. It is the mirror finally shown a new face. It is not a seed dug up and doubted. It is a seed planted once and left to root in peace. It is not an old identity fought against forever. It is an old identity gently let go, so the true one can finally stand up. It is not a feeling waited for. It is a key turned before the feeling arrives. It is not a river that runs dry. It is a gate that finally learns to open. It is not the mouth speaking by accident. It is the mouth finally speaking on purpose. It is not anxious watching that brings the answer. It is peaceful expectancy that lets it land. And it is not a crown given later to someone more deserving. It is the crown you were wearing this entire time, and when you look closely at all 9 of these, you will notice they were never 9 separate keys at all. They were 9 turns of the very same key, and that one key, the only one that ever truly mattered underneath all the rest, is simply this: your own consciousness, spoken aloud and believed within, is the one true maker of your wealth. If you want this teaching to keep unfolding for you day by day, in your own voice, in your own hands, that is exactly what the Overflow Covenant was built to be: a gentle daily companion of decrees, reflections, and Florence Scovel Shinn's own wisdom carried into modern language. So this work does not stay a single video you watched once, but becomes a living practice you return to. It is available now for a simple one-time gift of $27, fully backed by a 30-day peace of mind guarantee. So there is truly nothing to risk and everything to gain. You will find the link in the description below, and I hope you will let it become part of how you build the wealth consciousness you have already begun claiming today. Say it once more with me now. Wherever you are, I am the chosen vessel for my own good. Wealth is already coming to meet me. My word is my wand. And so, the sign you kept seeing was never a stranger knocking on someone else's door. It was always wealth, quietly, patiently, lovingly, coming to meet you.